What is a feast to a poor beggar? Is it bacon and eggs? Is it a kettle full of stew? Or is it a crust of bread from the keeper of the poorhouse? Poverty is a fact of life in the 18th century. It's very difficult on adults and children alike. Whole families were in destitution, whether they're in Europe, Great Britain, or North America. Today, I want a victory for this poor beggar. We are going to make them a feast. When I think of beggars in the 18th century, I see the artwork in my head, and they're all European beggars, sometimes walking through the countryside or in the big cities of Europe, especially London. But when I think about North American colonies, I can't envision any beggars. In fact, if we read a lot of the writings from the time period, we don't really hear many people talking about poverty. In fact, they're saying, oh, it's wonderful in North America, and there isn't any great quantity of poverty. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. There is a lot of poverty in colonial America. Many people are coming to the colonies as transported criminals, and they have to work for 7 or 14 years before they're free. And other people are coming as indentured servants. So many of these transported criminals and indentured servants, even if they survive their indentureship, never get out of poverty. And a large quantity of people along the coast, they're sailors. Sailors are some of the lowest paid workers in colonial America. These people, again, never make it out of poverty for the most part. So there is a lot of poverty going on, whether it's people in the cities, which actually they're probably more like big towns to us, or people out on the frontier. Yes, the vast majority of people out on the frontier, we would probably call very poor. Now, how did they deal with the poor, either in Great Britain or in colonial America? Well, they had poor laws. So they took up taxes, and it was part of the local government's job to take care of the destitute, the people that really needed to be fed that might starve to death. There are 3 different main ways that these local governments would try to deal with poor people. They had what was called out help, where they would just basically give little amounts of money or particular care to, say, families. They would supply them with a little bit of firewood or a little bit of money to buy food. Then they had a concept of sort of inside help, that they would take these people that were destitute and they would put them into an institution. Maybe they would call it a workhouse or a bettering house or an almshouse. They all had the same kind of concept, that it was easier to take care of these people if they brought them into an institution rather than giving them funds. The third method of helping people was indenturing them out into the community. So they would basically come up with contracts, and then someone in the community would use their labor, would be in charge of taking care of that person. And that happens a lot. Sometimes there's a mixture of these happening within individuals. So they'll start working in an outside help way, but if that family isn't really getting back up on its feet, then they'll bring part of the family into an institution, and then the children, they will bind out, or they will send them out into the community to work as servants in other households. And so many times this was a family destroying kind of situation. They were doing their best to feed these people, but this was the only way they knew how to help them. If you were assigned to the workhouse, if that's where you were put because you were poor, what would you expect to eat? So many times these workhouses, their rules were they just had to feed the people properly. And that means whoever's in charge of the workhouse would just figure out how to feed people as inexpensively as they possibly could. We do have some descriptions of workhouse food. Now, a typical breakfast, well, it's going to be something like bread and cheese, possibly a little oatmeal, some milk porridge. The same thing is happening for your evening meal. But the main meal of the day, sometimes that's a little more substantial. After all, this was many times called a workhouse. They wanted people to be able to do some work. So they're feeding them boiled beef with root vegetables as a main dish, or possibly peas pudding, maybe some bread, maybe even a little bit of beer. So what we're going to make today for our Beggars Feast are 3 different things. We're going to be making a boiled beef sort of soup. We're going to have a suet pudding, which is almost like a dessert for our time period. We'll also make a very simple brown bread, and we'll have a little bit of beer. We're gonna start with our suet pudding because that's gonna take the largest quantity of time. That needs to kind of go in and start boiling right away. And a suet pudding is very, very simple. It's flour, it's suet, which gives it that kind of nice texture. It's got some very inexpensive spice in it, which is a little bit of salt and some ginger. And then we mix up a few eggs and a little bit of milk, and we bundle that up into a pudding cloth. Off it goes, and we start that boiling in our water. The biggest driver of poverty in our time period are health problems. Good medical care in the 18th century, almost impossible. And if someone is sick with a long-term illness, not only are they expensive to take care of, but they're not earning any money. So any kind of health issue can immediately push a family into poverty. And they have to go to inside help. They take them out of their home and they put them into an institution, a workhouse, an almshouse. They, of course, can't get them to work if they're not healthy. So all these institutions almost immediately had to become hospitals. And in fact, those are the forerunners of modern hospitals. They all started off as some kind of institutions for the poor. What's interesting today is we think about hospitals as high-tech, and we think about them possibly as expensive institutions. In our time period, they're for the poorest of the poor. So the rich people, they never went to a hospital. They would generally have their health care done in their homes. Their doctors would visit them and they would do whatever they could there. But these institutions in the time period, these hospitals, were the training facilities for doctors. They could interact with the most amount of people and do the most learning in those kinds of situations. The next thing we're going to work on for our Beggars Feast is our main broth soup. We have a little bit of beef here, and we're going to start it boiling in some water. Many times you see these menus and they say broth. And it could be that they boil this beef and maybe for breakfast, you don't even get any meat in your soup. It's just the broth that came off of something you boiled earlier. After a little while, we're gonna put in our root vegetables, some carrots, some potatoes. Again, very inexpensive, and most likely that the cuts of beef that they would use in something like this beef broth, or we would call it a beef soup, would be the least expensive cuts possible. Sort of shin bone cuts or whatever. We've just got some regular stew meat. Many families would do whatever it took to stay out of the workhouse or the poorhouse. And there were different kinds of jobs people could do. You could go around, you could collect ashes, or you could collect night soil or urine at different times of the day. You could have some of the dirtiest jobs, but the jobs needed to be done. They could earn enough money to keep you out of the poorhouse. One of the reasons why you wanted to stay out of the poorhouse was because even though it was sort of like a hospital in one way, it was also like a prison in another way. They would get a criminal element in the workhouses, and they would also treat them like criminals. You couldn't necessarily, leave whenever you wanted to. And you had to do certain menial jobs when you were inside the workhouse. Maybe you would have to work up junk, which is taking apart old ropes and fraying them and working them, or doing something like trying to make shoes. They also tried working on a linen industry where they had people both spinning and weaving in the workhouse. Now, it turns out that no matter how much they tried to make these workhouses pay for themselves, they never did. They were always a money-losing proposition. Early on in the concept of these workhouses, they thought, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to get these poor people back to work and they'll actually pay for themselves. Well, that never worked. In certain communities, they would have to wear a badge. It had a red P on it, it might have the initials of your town on it, and you had to wear that on your clothes at all times. They were trying in the towns to discourage this outside help as much as possible. You were supposed to be ashamed if you had to wear the P badge around town because you got outside help. For our last recipe, we'll be doing the classic workhouse bread. This is a nice brown bread, inexpensive, no special ingredients, and very simple to make. As I was researching this topic, I thought it was interesting. It's a difficult topic. Yes, colonial America has a lot of very, very poor people in it. People that were in a begging kind of situation, destitute people in difficult situations. And the people in the 18th century that weren't poor were trying to find a solution for this. And they tried a lot of different things. I think they had, most of them, the right kind of intention, even if today we look back on their methods and see them as unworkable or cruel. The reality, though, is that all those people, whether they were trying to fix the problem or the poor themselves, were real people in a real time. The 18th century isn't a fairy tale that we tell ourselves or some perfect world like sometimes they wanted to say it was. No, it was real life, and they had the same kind of problems that we do today. And I think their stories need to be told and understood, even if it might be sometimes a bleak story or one that's difficult to hear. This is the Poor Beggar's Feast, and it is very good. What is a feast to a rich man? Is it a table filled with food? Is it the highest quality ingredients possible? Or is it exotic foods from halfway across the world? The reality of a rich man's feast is it is all three of those things. Now, here's the problem. I've resisted making this video for a good year. We have done the Beggar's Feast. We've done a poor man's feast, a poor soldier's feast, a poor officer's feast. Those feast videos are easy for us to pull off because they include the ingredients and the kinds of foods that we have every day. Even something as simple as the outfit, I can easily replicate for all those other people. But a rich man in the 18th century? Well, something like a typical rich man's outfit that he would wear to a fine dinner party in the 18th century might cost $10,000. The reality is there is a giant chasm between the classes in the 18th century. There is really not a lot of middle class. There's a tremendous quantity of poor people, or very, let's say, lower class people in the 18th century. And then this tiny sliver of extremely rich people. And they lived amazing lives. And they had these amazing dinners. Here's what I can show you, and here's what's kind of interesting. For more than, say, 10 years, we've been doing these historical food episodes. And a lot of these come out of the English cookery books of the 18th century. Now, these cookery books weren't necessarily written for the rich. The rich had French chefs, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't need a book to tell them how to cook fancy food. But the people who wanted to be upwardly mobile, they were looking to emulate this very, very expensive food. And so these cookbooks were created for them. The vast majority of cookbooks in this time period are written for these people that are moving from lower class and trying to look like they're upper class. So all these dishes that we've done, well, most of them are people trying to look like they're eating this rich man's feast. So the difference tends to be this quantity and quality. The fact that we would have 2 or 3 removes. In other words, the table would fill up with food 2 or 3 times in one of these fancy rich man's feasts. But what's happening with these individual dishes? We've talked about how they came out of these cookbooks. Here are the top 10 dishes that show up on the table of King George III. Chicken broth, sweet tarts, roasted capon, that's a special chicken, roast mutton, asparagus, lobster, spinach, artichokes, roast chicken, roast beef. Nothing here sounds incredible, does it? They're all probably fixed in a rather fancy way, but I mean, here they are, King George III, and he's eating, fairly plain dishes. Now, his feast is going to have all of these things on the table, plus more. Then exotic things like maybe sea turtle and all these things spiced with incredibly expensive spices and to a richness that we can't imagine. On a table with plates that each one might pay for a regular person's wages the entire year, with sterling silver silverware and expensive glasses of wine. The difference isn't necessarily in one individual dish, but in the plethora of riches that we see around us on the table. Now, we aren't going to make a table with 100 dishes. We don't have the 3 or 4 days and an army of cooks and chefs to do that. But we are going to make 3 separate dishes that you might see in a rich man's feast. We'll do a roast capon. We'll do a special spinach dish, and we'll have some amazing sweet tarts. And to drink, I have, of course, the classic dessert wine, some Madeira. We're going to be doing a roast chicken or roast capon. And they would have made this sometimes in a simple way, like we're gonna do it, or very, very complicated. And in many of these fancy feasts, they would make it as complicated as they possibly could. Now, using a capon versus a chicken, that's a complication right there. You take a male chicken, and just when they start to, exhibit their maleness, you neuter them, and they, of course, grow much larger and have much more tender meat. They're like a very, very large chicken of the time period. You would take this capon and first you separate the skin from the meat of the chicken, and you stuff under that butter and herbs, and then you put bacon over the top of that, and then you cover it with paper. And we've experimented with covering with paper. For our roast chicken, we will take an onion stuck with cloves, we'll place that inside the chicken, and then we'll put it on the roasting spit and roast it over the fire. So we have this table set, and it's filled with massive quantities of food. But how is it served out? We might see particular things in our mind's eye about how this fancy meal goes on with this rich person, but we would probably be mistaken. So all the kind of service that we expect, how a fancy meal is served today, is actually something that's changed a lot from the 18th century to today. Today's style is based out of the Russian style of service that starts to become popular in the early 19th century. This idea that you're sitting at the table and here's your dishes and fancy food comes on your dish to you, and someone serves you like that. And it's all basically on your plate, and maybe there's some food items on the table. In the 18th century, we have a different style of service called the French style of service. And that is a table that you would have your empty plate in front of you with your silverware, but all around you are dishes of food. And the entire table, in fact, is laid out with all kinds of different sorts of food all around the table. So you're surrounded with dishes, and everyone at the table is surrounded likewise. And you would take a little bit and put it on your plate and possibly serve people around you. And if you wanted something from the far side of the table, you would probably ask a footman, although that could be considered kind of rude. You were so insistent on having some dish from halfway across the table that you had to ask for it. So more than likely, you would just deal with what was right around you. And there was so much. Even after this table is filled with all these dishes, you end up eating all that you need. You stop, they take all the things off the table, take your plate away, bring you a new plate, and reset the table with all new things. And they do that yet again for dessert. Can you imagine? For our spinach, we will do a classic 18th century version of creamed spinach inside of a French roll. We will take that spinach, we will stew it down in a little bit of water, and then we will chop it nice and small, mix in some cream, some butter, cook that up until it makes a nice creamy spinach sauce, and then we'll put that inside of a French roll, and then we'll cut that nicely so that it comes off, and then inside will be the green spinach. An example of some of the extravagance that we might see at one of these feasts happens in 1694, and it is in Edward Russell's house, and he's having a giant party out in his garden, and there are tables covered with cold collations, so meat dishes and whatnot, so people could just kind of wander around and eat. And there's a fountain in the middle of that, and here's a description of the fountain. In the fountain were the following ingredients: 4 hogsheads of brandy, think 200 or 300 gallons, 8 hogsheads of water, 25,000 lemons, 20 gallons of lime juice, 1,300 weight of fine white Lisbon sugar. That's very expensive in the time period. 5 pounds of grated nutmegs. Yes, 5 pounds of nutmegs. And then we have 300 toasted biscuits and a pipe of dry mountain Malaga wine. Over the fountain was a large canopy, built to keep the rain off, and built on purpose a little boat. Therein was a boy belonging to the fleet who rowed around the fountain and filled cups of the company. Yes, we have situations like this going on where people are making these extravagant sort of scenes, and they would do this especially for the dessert scene, where they might make a giant floating island. Imagine a table that's 6 feet deep and 20 feet long, and it would have a huge winter scene all done in sugar, with castles with little cannons that might fire and ships on a frozen lake. And all this is edible, well, at least sort of edible, and all just for the feast. So it's not only this amazing quantity of food, it's amazing expense and richness, but sometimes it's exoticness. And we have examples of lots of dishes like that: roasted swan, and of course sea turtle. And we have people like Jefferson when he's president. He wants to show off, and he's showing off with dishes that are Italian macaroni and cheese, or he's showing off with ice cream and it's baked inside of some kind of pastry so that it looks like it's, an impossible thing. How do you bake ice cream inside of a pastry? Yes, they wanted to show off in every way possible. The question is, did they actually enjoy this, or was it just for show? We have this quote from the 18th century: "Dinner is one of the most wearisome English experiences, lasting as it does 4 or 5 hours." I don't know, taking 4 or 5 hours to figure out how to get through this meal, it does sound a little grueling. We will be making one of the classic but simpler dessert dishes that, yes, still shows up on the rich man's feast. We will be doing some classic, very small tarts. Just a small, tiny little pie that has preserves and a little bit of fresh fruit. That'll be easy and just oh so delectable. Now, this feast isn't just about the food on the table, or the beautiful plates and the glasses of expensive wine, the beautiful room that we're having this feast in, but it's about the people that have to do it, the servants that we see in the room itself that are serving the food out, and then the kitchen in the background that, of course, nobody sees, that's filled with cooks and maids making all this wonderful food. And they have probably been working at it the entire week. We see, let's say, a roasting fireplace, and it has roasting spits for 7 or 8 different pieces of meat roasting at the same time. One person that is just there to rotate the meat slowly as it cooks, so it's all cooked perfectly and even. And then people that are just working on the pastry for this wonderful feast, and other people that are making all the different dishes. It's hard for us to imagine the number of people it would take to pull off a feast that they would have probably 3 or 4 times a year. Here we are with just 3 of these dishes from the rich man's feast, and it's already a rich meal with a beautiful chicken, a very interesting and probably very good spinach dish, and then these, of course, I know they're going to be wonderful little tarts over here, and then a Madeira to go with it to bring it all together. And I mean, can't we imagine just what it had been like if you were from the Beggars feast, if you were the beggar and you could just even see a meal like this? It would have been completely mind-blowing. Let's start with this spinach dish, and I haven't had one quite like this. And it really smelled good in the pan when it was cooking. And of course, going with this beautiful toasted bread. And you know, it doesn't necessarily look amazingly appetizing, but I think one of the whole points of the dish like this is to figure out how to serve it so it does look beautiful. And it is very good. Spinach isn't my favorite thing, but this turned out great. The big question about the chicken here is, did it stay nice and moist? And a lot of these recipes were specifically working really hard at keeping the chicken moist, which can be hard when it's roasting over an open fire. So that many times they covered them with paper and did all sorts of tricks to keep them nice and moist. Let's try a little bit of this. And did the onion with the cloves come through in this bird? Really good question. Totally moist. Turned out great, this one. And the spices come through, even though this was sort of in the breast. As it rotates though, all those juices from the inside, especially from that onion and the cloves, get to go through the bird. That's the whole reason for turning that bird as it's cooking. So that really makes it great. And for dessert, these beautiful tarts, and I mean, you can't go wrong with these. They're basically preserves inside of a wonderful pie shell. I even went and found a particular tart paste recipe that was very heavy on the butter. And that's the one I used, and it turned out really good looking. So let's find out what it tastes like. Those are so good. That paste was just tremendous in here. A pie crust that you just want to eat that by itself, that's for sure. This is just a tiny sliver of the rich man's feast, and it is very good. What do you think about when I say the word dessert? You're probably thinking about a hot fudge sundae, or maybe cheesecake, or maybe something simple like Jell-O with a whipped topping. Dessert is a sweet treat that ends the meal on a high note. So what about 250 years ago? What about 18th century America and say Great Britain? Did they even have dessert, especially for the working man? That's a really good question, and it's fun to dig in on this. The answer is they did want something sweet to end the meal with, but they didn't have the same kind of super sugary concept of a dessert that we do. They had a wonderful, hearty, and sometimes sweet treat to end their meal. To get a really good idea about this hard-working man's meal, William Ellis gives us a very good idea. So if we look in just regular 18th century cookbooks, they don't tell us about how they're using these dishes and kind of what level of society that they're for. But William Ellis, he's talking about the small farmer in England in 1750. And these small farmers, even if they were not very rich at all, they would still have itinerant workers come in at harvest time. When harvest happens, you have to have a lot of people on hand to take care of those crops. It isn't like today where you have all this machinery to do the work. So these small farmers had to figure out how to pay these itinerant workers, and part of that was room and board. They could stay at the farm and they were fed by the farmer. So in William Ellis's book, he goes into great detail about these workers and how to feed them as inexpensively as possible. But these workers, even though they were fairly itinerant, pretty low on the economic level, they expected something like dessert in their meal. He says they expect their meal to end with a pudding. Now, when they're saying the word pudding, they might mean a very specific kind of food, but they probably in some sense are almost talking about a class. They almost mean dessert. You don't see the word dessert very often in the 18th century, but you do see that word pudding, and they mean sort of the part of the meal that ends on a kind of a sweet note. Sometimes we have to understand these words and how they're used in different places, sort of like the word soda and pop. They're used in different regions in America to mean basically the same thing. That's what's going on here with this term pudding. Sometimes it's real specific, sometimes it's very generic. Here's a little quote out of William Ellis's book. He says, "Pudding is so natural to our harvestmen that without it, they think they cannot make an agreeable meal." Today we'll be making 4 classic desserts for these workmen, and these desserts all have something in common. They all have a twist to make them good for the workmen, and most of that has to do with their inexpensive ingredients or with the way in which you can eat them. And the classic sweetener in all these isn't sugar that we would expect. We use so much sugar today. They didn't hardly use any sugar, especially for these workmen. They would use things like apples and raisins for the sweetener. And this first classic recipe is a boiled pudding. And pudding per se, just like they would have, we've made many of them in the past. So I'm gonna mix my flour here with suet. Probably about 50-50, maybe a little less suet than that. And we're gonna mix that with a little bit of either water or milk so that it turns into a nice firm paste. Our boiled pudding will be made in a little different way. We're not going to be making this, softball sized boiled pudding. We don't want it to take that long. And there is a version where we make small ones, about the size of a golf ball. We'll also mix in some of our raisins. Now, we're not going to use a lot, and because this is a small version, I'm going to use currants instead, which are basically tiny raisins. And these will get rolled up into a nice little ball and then dunked into or put into boiling water. These will boil about 15 or 20 minutes, and then they should come out and they will be done. The nice part is they can go right on the plate as a full-size pudding instead of having to be sliced up. Our second recipe is something like a simplified apple pie or apple turnover. And we're gonna make this as the apple turnover specifically because that is the working man's meal. So sometimes, say in the past, we've had little meat pies, and those were a working man's meal. They could take the meat pie with them and eat the meat out of it and then just throw the shell away. Well, the apple pasties work in the same way, and here's what William Ellis says. It suits the hand or the pocket better than a round pie, and therefore they're commonly made in farmers' families. For one or a piece of one being carried in the plowman or the plowboy's pocket sustains the hunger till they come home to dinner, and oftentimes pleases them beyond some sort of more costly edibles. So these little hand pies could be something that's brought out to the field for the workers. So it's a perfect kind of meal for that. Our apple pasties are going to be so incredibly simple. I already have some pie crust that I made earlier, and we're gonna roll this out a little thick, not super thin, and we're gonna cut them in shapes, about 4 or 5 inches around. I've got some apples. Now, we could make an incredibly complicated apple interior for these, but a lot of the apple pie recipes here in William Ellis are very simple. At times, you just take the apples, you core them, you don't peel them or anything, you core them, put them in a pie crust, and you're done. That is it. And we're gonna make this a little bit more complicated in that we're going to pre-bake or parboil, as he talks about, so that we don't have to bake them as long, so the apples kind of break down a little bit. Put a little drop of butter in there with the apples. Take just a little bit of milk or maybe egg white along the edge, seal those up with as little air in them as you can get, and then we'll put them in the oven for, again, 10, 20, 30 minutes. In the 18th century, some of these things that we would classify as a dessert end up being an entire meal. And a perfect example of this is the Primitive Cookery Cookbook, where in the back of the cookbook, he describes entire meals for poor people, essentially. And he'll say something like, an apple pie makes a good meal, or a little bit of bread and cheese and some beer make a good meal, and white pot, which we would consider definitely a dessert. That'll make a good meal. Sort of like today if we said, ice cream, that'll make you a good lunch. We're also going to be making a simple fritter, a simple apple fritter. We're not going to boil it in a lot of oil, but almost pan fry it. So might also be classed as a fraise. So sometimes they made a little sort of almost like pancakes with fruit in the middle of them. Again, a classic kind of way to end a meal. Very inexpensive, just flour and a little bit of fruit, and that's about it. We're going to mix up some eggs, yolks and the whites, a little bit of milk, and we're going to make a batter. We'll put some spices in there, a little bit of ginger, one of the most inexpensive spices in the time period. We're going to have some minced up apple. That's really the sweetness here. Basically, we're deep pan frying these. We're just going to get a frying pan and put some lard in here, and that should give us something that's a little different than these other dishes. And the last one we want to do is a pudding, as it were, that's more classically North American. Now, if all the recipes that we've done so far, or talked about so far, have wheat flour in them. And wheat flour can be expensive depending on where you're at and if there's a problem with the wheat crop. And even in England, there were times when if wheat was expensive, they would substitute other kinds of flour. So they might use barley flour or oat flour or even rye flour, which would make a very good dessert. But in North America, the classic grain that we substitute is corn. And corn was used so often instead of wheat. Even though we might grow wheat, we would export it where it was much more expensive overseas, and we would use corn instead. So can we make a corn pudding? Well, the classic corn pudding was called Indian pudding, or we might just call it a corn pudding. They called it Indian pudding because it used Indian corn in it. And it's made in kind of a real similar way as a standard boiled pudding. And at times, they would even boil an Indian pudding. We are just going to bake it in a pan. Now, this is a special corn meal. It's made from Bloody Butcher corn. And a special thanks to Barnes Farms and Milling Company. He supplied me with a little bit of this to try out for this recipe, so this will be fun. This one is simple. We're going to mix this with a little bit of milk, so about 50-50 with milk. We boil this until it starts to thicken up a little bit. Basically, make a hasty pudding. Then we add to that an egg and a little bit of sweetener. And the sweetener that's a classic for especially backcountry and in North America is maple syrup or maple sugar. We put this into a well-buttered dish, and it goes into the oven and bakes at 350 degrees. If it was a bigger dish, and most of the time in our recipe books it calls for baking at 2 hours, this one will only need to bake about an hour. So what's this working day like for these hardworking harvest men that William Ellis talks about? He goes into great detail about feeding these harvest men, and he says the men generally eat 5 times a day. At the first setting out, they eat a little bread and cheese or apple pie with a draught of small beer. At 8 o'clock, some send for breakfast, boiled milk crumbled with bread. Others, milk porridge with bread. At dinner time, which is our lunch, it should always be at 1 o'clock, and the victuals to be sent into the field. Broad beans and bacon, or pork one day and beef with carrots or turnips with plum pudding. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon is what we call cheesing time. That is to say, a time when the men sit on the ground for a half an hour to eat bread and cheese with an apple pasty and drink some strong beer. At 8 o'clock, they come home for supper out of the field. And what's their supper? It's a new milk crumbed with bread, or a posset crumbed with bread, or fat bacon or pickled pork boiled hot with broad beans. Now, some of these farmers, they didn't want a big full meal for these workmen right there at that supper meal. They said that it would make the men sick. So they had these very light meals for supper time, probably to help them digest all their food so they'd be able to get up early in the morning and start the next day's work. Here we are, the working man's dessert, and we have 4 different kinds to try out. We've got a little boiled pudding here. You can see the plums in there. And the weird thing about boiled puddings is they're like boiled dough. In fact, the sailors have a dish that they call plum duff, and duff is short for dough. They would have the same kind of thing for dessert, maybe once a week. That's it. That's all that the sailors would get. But they would have their plum duff, which is plum dough, just like this. Here we have our apple hand pie, or pasty. I tried it with the apples a couple different ways just to see what would happen. They all turned out equally nice and soft. A little bit of butter in there, a nice, easy, simple crust. We've done a crust on the channel so many times. One of those things. Don't go out and buy a crust. Make a crust. It's not that hard. And let's try this out. Ooh. So good. Not a drop of sugar, and nice and sweet. A perfect workman's dessert. He's not going to complain about that. I'm not going to complain about that. I haven't done any of the fritters like this in a long time, so I'm interested to see exactly how this one turned out. I kind of experimented a little bit with the way the batter went on, but they look good, don't they? Turned out very good. I might add a little bit of seasoning into this one. I think it had a little ginger in it. Probably needs a little more, maybe a little salt added into that. This one I'm excited because of the grain, and the recipe is from American Cookery for the Indian pudding. So let's try this one out. That's a lot of pudding. So very good. Again, hardly any sweetener in this. I just had a little bit of maple syrup added into it, and tremendous. Now, some of these, they might have added a sauce, might have added say like a half butter and sugar sauce to go on top of those. But this is for the workman's dessert, so it's a little bit on the inexpensive side. Again, a special thanks to the Barnes Farms and Milling Company for the Bloody Butcher cornmeal. It turned out great in this particular recipe. And as these recipes go, all 4 of them are very good desserts. I can see them on the platter of any workman in the 18th century, and these workmen being very satisfied. If they're a great dessert in the 18th century, they certainly are one in the 21st. Imagine a food source that's so versatile, so prolific, so sustainable, and so vital that it supports a continent. Now that sounds wonderful, but the reality 400 and 500 years ago is as Europeans come into the New World, they think of corn as a barbarous, as a savage and primitive grain. Nothing could be further from the truth. The history of corn goes back thousands and thousands of years. In fact, some people think that humans started to evolve or modify corn as many as 9,000 years ago. Turning this simple grain into something that was so incredibly versatile that it could grow in South America, Central America, and up north all the way to Canada. That it could grow in places that it was very damp or very dry. That they could make different varieties that they could use as popcorn, or something they could eat green, or something they could dry and save for years. All the evidence suggests that corn was developed in this Central American region, that it was developed in such a way, and so highly developed, that it really couldn't survive upon its own. It's something that needs human intervention for it to continue to grow. Just leaving corn wild in a field, it will just devolve and stop growing very, very quickly. And yet when it is properly manipulated and developed by humans, corn is so amazingly productive that it's really hard to believe that one single kernel of corn can, in one generation, develop more than 1,000 kernels. So a 1,000-fold increase of food. Let me share a word with you, nixtamalization. What is the downfall of corn? If corn is your major component of your diet, then there's a problem. There are not complete amino acids that are available for humans to digest. And so the only way to make this corn a more rounded food product is to add some alkali component so that this makes it a more complete nutrition foodstuffs. So how did they do this in the time period? They would either soak in lye or they would add ashes to this food component. It's very, very interesting that even though this was a food that was developed for thousands of years, that the societies that relied on corn for a large portion of their food input, those are the places where the food processing or the kinds of ways they would cook their food would add in this alkali. So if one of these societies in Central or South America didn't need corn as a major component of their food, they didn't bother to add the alkali. They would just eat corn in a different kind of way. But any place that really survived upon corn, they would always add this alkali component to make a more complete nutrition package out of corn. In our 18th century context, we see this chemistry taking place in how Native Americans processed their corn, both in the ashes going into their parched corn and in soaking corn in lye. I find it very interesting that as soon as Christopher Columbus comes back from America, we see corn in Europe and in North Africa. It's already starting to move. It's something that's brought back almost immediately. It grows in Northern Africa, it grows in places like Turkey and Italy. Now, some people call it, and especially in Europe, they call it turkey corn because they had the mistaken impression that it actually came from Turkey when it was actually corn that was brought over from America. This is a description of exactly the way the Native Americans would have prepared their parched corn. This corn is first parboiled in water and then drained and well dried. When it is perfectly dried, it is then roasted in a plate made for the purpose, ashes being mixed with it to hinder it from burning. They are kept continually stirring that it may take only the red color that they want. When it has taken that color, they remove the ashes, rub it well, and then put it into a mortar with ashes of the dried stalks of kidney beans and a little water. They then beat it gently, which quickly breaks the husk and turns the whole into a meal. This meal, after being pounded, is dried in the sun, and after this last operation, it may be carried anywhere and will keep 6 months.
All of the recipes that we're going to make today are coming straight out of historical journals. These are foods that people were eating because they were in dire straits and there was nothing left to eat, or because it impacted them because of how good it was, or because of a ceremony it was involved with, or maybe something that they hadn't seen before. When John suggested this technique to me, this was something that kind of took me back because I haven't ever seen anything quite like this before. I was really excited to give it a try, to experiment with it. Hopefully we're gonna get it just right. We're using corn, obviously, in all of these recipes. This is dried corn. It's just simple, dried yellow corn. That's what we've got to work with here. Now, in this particular recipe, what they're talking about is taking this corn and parboiling it, and you're going to basically get it to puff up and kind of loosen up a little bit. This is corn that I have parboiled right here. And as you can see, it's wet. And it's gonna take a little while to dry out. And they put a lot of emphasis on all of this needs to be dry before you continue on to the next stage in the process. Once you have parboiled your corn and you've given it a chance to swell up a little bit, you'll notice that it's just kind of a little bit squishy to the touch. You're gonna set this aside to dry. And that's gonna take a while depending on where you are, how hot it is, the climate, that sort of thing. But you want all the moisture to dry out. It could take a couple of days. It might even take a week. I don't know, depending on where you are. But I've already set some aside to dry for the next step. But just make sure that you let it dry as much as you can. It needs to be very dry. And then we're gonna parch it. And when we parch it, we're gonna put this into a skillet. We're gonna turn that skillet up if you're using the stove at home, probably medium-high heat if you're over the fire. You don't wanna get too hot, you don't wanna burn it, but you want to continue to draw out the remaining moisture. Even though it feels dry to the hand, there's still some moisture in there. And what happens when you parch corn is it begins to swell as it heats up and it pops. It's not gonna pop like popcorn, but it's driving that moisture out, and the husk around the corn is gonna crack. It's gonna pop just a little bit. You're gonna hear it audibly, and you'll even see some bouncing around going in the skillet. If you're doing it in your house, you might wanna have a lid close by just in case it pops a lot, because it can sometimes. When we parch it, it A, gets all the moisture out, and B, it softens it. It kind of cracks that open, and then you would be able to take something that you couldn't just chew on, and then you would be able to chew on that. Some people even take parched corn, put some salt on it, eat it like a snack. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna grind it down into meal. Our corn is parched, it's looking really great. We did not use any wood ash in the parching process. In this environment, we don't need to. Oftentimes over the campfire, you don't need to either, but we do see that in a lot of historical contexts that they sometimes do, sometimes don't. I don't really know what all the reasoning there is, but I knew that I didn't need to for this because I've done it before. There is another ash that they talk about in this recipe, and that is the ash from the stalks of kidney beans. And I have that right here. I've prepared that ahead of time. So we're gonna get some corn in the mortar and we're gonna add a little bit of this ash. It doesn't give us any ratio, so we're just gonna have to eye this. And I'm gonna start grinding away. Our mixture is ready. Right here we have our cornmeal mixed with our ashes, and it's like a corn flour. That's what we've got going on here. In the reading, what they say is that when you want to consume it, you will mix 1/3 of the meal with 2/3 water, and in time it will swell, and it says in just a couple of minutes. This is mixed up well. It has definitely expanded. It's got a pudding consistency. Let's give it a shot. It's surprisingly gritty. The corn doesn't really come through. It tastes really earthy. And a pinch, this is gonna keep you going. I think it's definitely survival food, but it's not gourmet.
So what did Europeans think when they first came upon corn? What were their ideas? We have a writing from the late 16th century. This is the 1590s, and this is the first Englishman to come back and describe America from someone's point of view that was actually there, rather than from a third-hand account. He writes about corn. He says, pagator. It's a kind of grain so called by the inhabitants. The same in the West Indies is called maize. Englishmen call it Guinea wheat or Turkey wheat, according to the names of the countries from whence it hath been brought. Now, he was wrong about that, but that's just what people thought. The grain is about the bigness of our ordinary English peas, and not much different in form or shape, but of diverse colors, some white, some red, some yellow, some blue. All of them yield a very white and sweet flour, being used according to his kind, making a very good bread. He goes on to describe how they also make it into corn beer and corn ale, which I think is very interesting. Already in the 16th century, they're thinking about making beer out of corn. He goes on to describe the plant, how tall it grows, and he says how great an increase it has, how prolific, how much corn grows from a single grain. He sees amazing potential for this, but it's not like he's accepting this as a food source for Europeans right away. Fast forward 30 years, we go up to the Massachusetts area where the Puritans first land on shore, wanting to start the Plymouth colony. And they, at very first, land and find an Indian graveyard and a store of buried Indian corn. They take some of this, knowing that they might need it to plant the next year. The reality is when these Puritans come to the New World, their old world grains do not grow well here. It's very difficult in a brand new location to get something like wheat or barley or rye to grow well. They survive upon corn. They have to learn how to grow it from the Native Americans that are there. And we have a writing from 1636 where somebody's talking about these very first people having to survive on corn alone. For the want of English grain, wheat, barley, rye proves a sore affliction to some whose stomachs cannot live upon Indian bread, but were compelled to it until the cattle increased and the plows could go. He talks about how this corn it doesn't eat well. It doesn't work for the people, but they have to survive upon that because the other crops aren't working. Talk about providence. Imagine showing up in the New World and there are these Native Americans there and someone actually speaks English. No one's been along the coast here, nobody's settled in North America, and yet they run into someone, Squanto, who speaks English and can teach them how to plant corn, how to fish, how to survive in this new world. We can learn a lot about Native Americans and specifically how they used corn by various writings in the middle part of the 18th century. Both Heckewelder, who is a missionary to Native Americans, and Colonel James Smith, who's taken captive by Native Americans and adopted into a tribe. He's got this wonderful journal or memoir talking about his entire life. And he spends a lot of time with the years that he spends with the Native Americans. And he has to learn and survive to live in the wilderness just like they do. Here's a section of his book right after he's adopted into the tribe. He says, after this ceremony was over, I was introduced to my new kin and told that I was to attend a feast that evening, which I did. And as the custom was, they gave me also a bowl and a wooden spoon, which I carried with me to the place, where there was a number of large brass kettles full of boiled venison and green corn. Everyone advanced with his bowl and a spoon and had his share given him. And after this, one of the chiefs made a short speech and we began to eat.
I've been rereading the journal of Colonel James Smith. I love this journal. It's one of my favorite journals in history. It's just so chock full of really interesting information. He's living with the natives for about 5 years and he's learning so much from them. This is my favorite reference to corn, and corn is mentioned so many times in this thing. But it's kind of beautiful. It's after the ceremony and they're getting ready to celebrate. They sit down and it's this really simple dish, but it just feels so homey. And I know that they were just the way that they were describing it, they were really loving this. And so it's gonna be really simple. We're gonna take green corn, and that's still soft corn, right here on the cob, and we're gonna cut it off. And we're gonna take our venison and we're gonna cut this up into small pieces. We're gonna put it with just a little bit of water and we're gonna boil it. We're not gonna add any spices. We're not gonna salt and pepper this thing because they didn't, in the book at least, they didn't mention it. And I don't believe that they had all of those things at that time to be able to spruce it up. So we're gonna keep it as simple as possible. We're just gonna let the sweetness of the corn shine through and let that venison be the meaty kind of stick to your ribs component. When they're talking about green corn, they're talking about what we eat regularly, like as a side dish, fresh corn that is soft. Corn on the cob, an ear of corn from your garden, corn out of a can, frozen corn that you get at the grocery store. All of those are examples of green corn where it's still soft, it's not dried, it's not something that's been stored away, but it is fresh, it's green corn.
As important as corn was, it's interesting to see how it's interpreted and thought about by the people living in North America even 150 years, 160 years after they've started settling in the New World. So they've been using corn to survive upon, but what are they thinking about it within themselves? So here's a very interesting reading. This is from 1780. Joseph Plum Martin was an American soldier, and he was sustained upon a lot of corn products. In fact, sometimes it seems like cornmeal was the only thing the soldiers had to eat. But at one point, he's talking about a time when they were in a house and loyalists came into the house. They fled the scene and the loyalists were searching their house. They had left behind some of their food, and here's what happens. He says, when they could find, this is the loyalists, when they could find none to wreak their vengeance upon, they cut open the knapsacks of the guard and strew the Indian meal about the floor, laughing at the poverty of the Yankee soldiery who had nothing but hog's fodder, as they termed it, to eat. So these loyalists weren't from England, which I'm sure the English soldiers would have thought exactly the same thing. So here are some people within the colonies thinking corn is, hey, this is a staple and we're going to survive upon it. And then other people who are living here saying that's nothing but hog's fodder, which is generally a typical way of viewing it from the European sense. It is very interesting to me that, yes, we are 160 years or 180 years after the first introduction of corn into the diet of these European settlers. And even after all this time, we have conflicting ideas about what's going on with corn and how important it is to the colonies. This is one of the most important foodstuffs in all of the colonies. It's fed to animals, it's fed to people, it's used on all the different socioeconomic levels. We have a letter that Benjamin Franklin writes to people in France in the 1780s, and they're having a problem with growing enough wheat for the amount of people they have. And he's saying, you need to adopt more corn, you need to use corn. And he goes into a great explanation of how it's grown and how it's eaten. He's pointing to this because he thinks it's important for the survival of even people in Europe. And yet we have people in the United States that still are shunning the idea of eating a great quantity of corn. And then other people who look at corn as the great inexpensive food that it is. They are proud that this very inexpensive food is something that they survive upon. They write poems about it, they write books about it. They think it's the most important thing for people to accept as a food and as a foundation for their diets. Here's Joseph Blum Martin talking about how these soldiers ate or cooked their cornmeal. He says, "We had no wheat flour. All the bread stuff we got was Indian cornmeal or Indian corn flour. Our Connecticut Yankees were as ignorant of making this meal or flour into bread as a wild Indian would be of making pound cake. All we had any idea of doing with it was to make it into hasty pudding."
You read these stories about soldiers in dire straits and you think, could I do that? Would I be able to get through on just the simplest ingredients without any flavor whatsoever? There's so many times where you're reading these journals and people are like, I just wish that I had some salt. We're going to make this hasty pudding with cornmeal without anything, without salt. We're gonna have a little bit of maple syrup because it's very likely that they would have been able to get a hold of that, but we're not gonna season this as we go. And it's a very simple recipe. You can't really go wrong with it. It's water and it's cornmeal. Now we are using a special cornmeal. It's very period correct cornmeal. I'm excited to try it. I'm excited to see how this comes together. And really, we're just gonna use 2 cups of water and somewhere between a 1/4 cup and a 1/2 cup of cornmeal, depending on consistency, and we'll know that as we're going. We're gonna make sure to keep it stirring the whole time. And as we add the cornmeal, we're just gonna add it a little bit at a time while we're stirring so that the boil continues to be happening. We don't wanna dump the whole thing in there and kill the boil of the water. We want it to continue to stay hot as we're adding the cornmeal. And then it's probably gonna take a good 15, 20, maybe even 30 minutes to set up right. And we're gonna stir it pretty much the whole time. When you're making this, you want a fairly coarse ground cornmeal. You don't want super fine. And if you wanna get something close to period correct, there's Barnes Farm and Milling Company down in Salem, Kentucky. That's where we got this. We've gotten other ingredients from them in the past, and they've treated us really well. Make sure to go look them up. If you wanna make anything with period correct corn ingredients, that's the place to go.
Without corn, without learning about the plant itself, how to use it, even how to prepare it, the colonists wouldn't have been able to survive in North America. Without this commodity, they wouldn't have been able to survive. It wouldn't have been economically possible. It wouldn't even have been just physically possible. They wouldn't have been able to learn this unless they got this information from the Native Americans. The Native Americans who've been surviving on this food for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Imagine you're on a 2-month expedition into the wilderness and all you have to eat is salt pork, dried peas, and ship's biscuit. This is the life of the French voyageur in the late 18th century. They're living a life where they're going into the frontier constantly, going with large boats, large canoes, and going into the frontier to trade for furs with the Native Americans. Rivers and lakes of this time period were the superhighways. They're the way that people can get into the deep frontier in North America to access these markets that they would never be able to get to in any other way. They're using birch bark canoes. They're also using bateaux made of regular wooden planks. They're being manned by these voyageurs and boatmen. And it takes a special kind of person to be able to do this job. You can imagine going into the frontier. It's hard enough to live in the woods, but you also have to paddle or work these boats 12 and 16 hours a day. Some of the most difficult physical labor possible in a very dangerous environment. Our French-Canadian voyageurs are from Quebec, and yet the area they're working within extends much further west, further south, and even further north. The region in which they're working in is huge. They are the long-haul truckers of the late 18th century. Their travels could take them easily 1,000 miles into the wilderness. There are different boats for different jobs, but there are many things that are happening on the frontier. People are taking goods out, sometimes taking people out. At times they're ferrying people across rivers or across large lakes. And it's an arduous job. Now, you're doing this job and you don't have a lot of room for provision, but you have to take along enough to survive upon completely. The food you bring along has to meet a lot of different requirements. It has to be something that's very dense, has a lot of energy in it, is easy to keep in a edible form. It can't be damaged by temperature or a little bit of dampness. It takes a special kind of food to fuel this journey. Your cooking equipment is also a major problem. You can't bring along an entire stove and 14 pots and dishes to do this. It has to be all happening in one pot. So what meets all these requirements? There's a wonderful journal from 1795 by Isaac Weld, and he travels through the United States and in Lower Canada, and he gives us a wonderful description of this particular setting. He says, on setting out, each man is furnished with a certain allowance of salted pork, biscuit, peas, and brandy. The peas and biscuit they boil with some pork into a porridge, and a large vessel full of it is generally kept at the head of the bateau for the use of the crew when they stop in the course of the day. These men are surviving on this one dish that they make once a day. They boil up salt pork with peas and ship's biscuit into this solid sort of porridge that they can therefore sample all throughout the day to keep them going. Can you imagine this pot full of green, strange porridge in the front of your boat, and whenever you get hungry, you go up and you fill up your bowl, you eat that, and you get right back to work. This might seem like a strange food for us today, and it is to a certain extent. Imagine your boat or your canoe has barrels of salt pork in it, and salt pork is exactly that and nothing else. It is pork that is submerged in salt, and we're using the entire pig at times. You might even find a hog's head in your barrel of salt pork. It's not just a particular cut, but the entire animal. Salt pork was a huge industry in the 18th century because this provision was so important, not only for sailors on the ocean, but for inland provision, like for our voyageurs, or just regular households. Some people are surviving on salt pork the entire year, shunning fresh provisions because they could sell those off at a better price. Salt pork is prepared by butchering your hog and lightly salting the meat, letting all the blood drain out of it. The salt is packed around every single piece and it's tightly put into a barrel. And this salt pork can last for up to a year, possibly longer. There are a few references in the 18th century to people eating their salt pork raw. They basically just knock all the salt off of it and eat it as it is. But that's an emergency kind of setting. I definitely wouldn't suggest that for anyone. Most of our recipes in the 18th century use salt pork, and they soak it in fresh water, changing the water several times to make it less salty. This dish is easy to prepare, but it does have several steps to it. First off, we're going to start off with our salt pork. Our salt pork has to be soaked, and I'm going to soak this salt pork overnight and then cut it up into nice gobbets, a small edible bite-sized piece. This recipe is made to cook up and serve in one vessel. So we're going to start off with cold water, add our salt pork to it, and bring it to a boil. Once that's brought to a boil, we're going to put in our also soaked dried peas. And here we're going to be using split peas. They might have had whole peas. There are times when they might have used beans instead. Again, we have to get those pre-soaked also. Once our pork and our peas are boiling in our vessel, we're just going to leave that boil for an hour or so. And once that's started to break up, then we add our ship's biscuit. And this is going to give us another nice texture in here. The ship's biscuit is another important component to this, and it's going to add a lot of calories to it. It is one of those classic ship's provisions and provision that can be used for a long time, as long as it's kept dry. And here we're going to pound it up into bits. We could pound the ship's biscuit all the way up into a flour and just use it as a thickener, but we're gonna leave these chunks a little bigger, and that will give us a nice texture and feel. It doesn't need to boil too long once it's got the ship's biscuit in it. Normally about 20 minutes, a half hour. We don't want to get those ship's biscuits so they're too soft. If you've been on the channel before, you know we've talked about pemmican. And pemmican is really important for these same set of people. But this pemmican is what comes in after this dish. Pemmican actually replaces salt pork in so much of the provision of the voyageurs and the people that are doing that kind of a job. Pemmican is even more dense and more powerful of food to bring along. But salt pork is what there was before pemmican was really discovered to be even better. Isaac Weld, who wrote this text, also describes our voyageurs in great detail. And he gives us some wonderful pictures talking about how they like to sing as they canoe along, about how they sleep at night. They just sleep on the grass with their short blankets. They don't have a blanket that covers themselves. And even when it rains, they just sleep out in the rain. And they really enjoy their job. Even though it's hard, it probably doesn't pay well. Certainly the food doesn't look necessarily delicious, but they would much rather be doing this job than being a simple farmer. It's very interesting to compare the voyageurs to something like the cowboys. The heyday of the cowboy is only like a 10 or a 15-year time period, whereas voyageurs were important from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, an almost 200-year time span when these men working in the frontier were an important part of the economy. When trains and other kinds of transport become popular in the middle of the 19th century, the occupation of the voyageur disappears. Our voyageur stew is ready to try out. It's still nice and hot. And you know, it doesn't necessarily look terribly appetizing, but I'll bet after a day of canoeing in the wilderness, this would hit the spot. Well, it's really got some wonderful flavors. You don't need any seasoning or salt. There's enough salt that comes in with the salt pork. The ship's biscuit has still got a wonderful texture in here. It might not look appetizing, but it's very, very good. Imagine you're in charge of feeding 200 people. Not only that, but you are at sea for 3 months on a wooden vessel only 120 feet long. How are you going to do this? A 32-gun frigate in the 18th century was a medium-sized warship. This ship is probably 120 or 140 feet long and maximum 30 feet wide, with an array of cannons on board. And this is the kind of ship that goes all over the world to take care of small problems. This isn't the kind of ship that's in a line of battle with, giant battleships all lined up, but they go on independent missions. Now, they have a very challenging environment, especially the cook. The main ship's cook has to cook for all the normal sailors on board as well as the soldiers. And he has to get these men fed in a very, very short period of time, because there is a special cook that does the cooking just for the officers, and then probably a cook just for the captain himself. Moving all these soldiers and sailors over the ocean in this rickety wooden vessel calls for a very complex and rigid system of rules, a tradition that has to extend for centuries. For all this tradition, it's amazing how many people wanted to change the Navy and to change things going on in this late 18th century. So John Cochrane writes this little book called The Seaman's Guide. But basically this book is mostly all about bread and how can we bake bread on board ship. The standard sailor's ration of this time period was a gallon of beer, and every day they would get a pound of ship's biscuits. And ship's biscuits are the hardest bread known to mankind. You can use them to hammer in a nail. The author here thinks that soft bread would be so much better for these sailors. And how can soft bread be baked on board ship? There are different problems with bringing bread on board ship. If we're at sea for months at a time, we can't bring soft bread from on land. It's going to get bad in just a couple of days. Certainly by the first week, it's already starting to turn green. It might sound easy to bake bread at sea, but we have a lot of different kinds of problems. We need to have a fairly large oven, and we need to have the materials. Flour, that's no problem, but yeast is the big problem. And he spends most of the book here talking about the problem of yeast at sea. Bread in Great Britain and North America at the time was mostly baked with a liquid yeast that you got from the brewer. Now that's a problem at sea. There is no brewer right down the street that we can go get our yeast. So how do they do this? How do they leaven bread at sea? What John Cochrane is suggesting here is called either the old dough technique or the leaven technique. And this is a bread method they were using on the continent in Europe, especially France and other places. So this is the typical liquid yeast that people would be making their bread with in Great Britain and North America. They would get this from the brewer and they would get it fresh every time. This might have a little bit of hopsy flavor to it, but mostly it's probably from ale, which doesn't have a lot of hops in it and it wouldn't be very bitter. So what happens if we can't get that? If we're on board ship, then we can use this leaven technique, and we talked about it before. It has to do with taking a lump of dough from a bread baking that you've already done a previous day, 2 or 3 days previously. When you've done this, you tear off a specific section of dough and you leave it behind for your next day's bread, or maybe 2 or 3 days in advance. The yeast will stay alive, and he takes a long time talking about the 3 stages of yeast inside your bread. Now remember, 1797, they did not know what yeast really was. They had no way of understanding exactly its essence. So they just knew that if you used this old dough, that the yeast was still alive in that, and that it would go through these 3 stages of kind of a early fermentation stage, a standard fermentation stage, and then a late stage, which he calls putrid. Bacteria actually starts to live in it, and it gets very sour and almost, well, smelling like rotten bread. That's what happens if we just leave dough around for 3 or 4 days. It starts to go really bad. But he says if we keep feeding this yeast with fresh flour, it will stay in a proper fermentation stage, and we can just keep using it and using it and using it. And so that's the technique that he really wants us to kind of embrace. A technique that was used for hundreds of years over in France and other places in Europe, and even as he was speaking, was starting to be used in places like Edinburgh. I think the reason why in France and other places they're using this old dough technique is because they don't have the fresh yeast either. In that instead of drinking beer and ale, they're drinking wine, and they don't have access to that same kind of yeast. So they are kind of forced to use this old dough technique. For the bread that Cochrane suggested, we have just 4 ingredients, and these are the standard 4 ingredients that every real bread in the 18th century is made out of. We have flour, we have water, we have salt, and we have whatever we're using, leaven or yeast. So I've got flour here and a little bit of salt and water, and then we're gonna take this lump of dough from a couple of days ago and we're going to break it up, and it'll work its way through our entire loaf. To mix our bread, I'm not even going to do any great quantity of measuring, and they certainly didn't do that in the 18th century. They took a large pile of flour and they start mixing the ingredients in. We are just trying to get to a certain consistency. After that's all kneaded and mixed together, we're going to set it aside to rise, and we'll let that rise for a couple of hours, maybe longer depending on how warm our environment is. And since this old dough, it may be 3 or 4 generations old, it might take a little bit longer, but that's okay. Maybe it might take all evening or an entire day, but it'll work out as long as we give it a little bit of time and where it's not too cold. After it's risen once, we can go ahead and punch that down, knead it a little bit, and let it rise another amount of time. Generally, it doesn't have to rise quite as long that second time, and form it up into our loaf. Then after its second rising, we can put it right into the oven. Depending on the size of your loaf, if you're baking this into a modern oven, I'd go ahead and set it at 400 degrees and it might bake for 30 minutes. Bread isn't some magical stuff. It is something that just about anybody can make, and I really want to encourage everyone to try this out. It may not be the perfect loaf of bread like you get in the grocery store, but that's not what they had in the 18th century, and that's not real bread anyway. So what is it like on board ship when you are the cook? What is your ship's galley like? As they move into the 18th century, a special kind of galley stove comes into use, especially in the British Navy, and probably something very similar in other navies. We would kind of recognize it as a stove, wood-fired, with an oven on one side and a very large cooking vessel built into this. This is a very dangerous spot in the ship when you have fire going on, and 18th century ships are basically a big match. The vast majority of cooking on board ship, especially for the common sailors and soldiers, is boiling, and that's why they have this large boiling vessel. You can basically fit everything you need to cook for all those 200 men inside of that vessel. Beside that, there is probably a small oven area. We can imagine this being maybe even half the size of an apartment oven, and possibly even an area so that you can roast off to the side. For smaller ships and gunboats, sometimes the ship's galley is just a small brick hearth with the cooking vessel in that. Again, very dangerous. And if you are at sea and it's a rough sea, maybe you have a storm or there's just big waves, you can't start the stove at all. You're going to eat all your food cold. And you hear about sailors complaining about that over and over again. You might have to go days and days with no hot food. The ship's galley is usually located below decks on these larger military vessels, but on smaller commercial vessels, they might have it bolted on the deck so that it's out there in the wind and sometimes in the weather, but it's also a safer location. And these ship's galleys on these smaller ships might only be, say, 4 feet square. Very, very small kitchen area. They were experimenting with some other kinds of cooking vessels in this time period. They had pressure cookers, sometimes called digesters, but they were very dangerous and sometimes exploded because the people didn't know how to use them. It was very important to keep the sailors happy on board ship. After all, without them, the ship can't sail. And especially on board a man of war like this, there are a lot more sailors than there are officers or the captain. And food is a big part of that. So there's a lot of tradition in the food of the sailors. They expected a certain kind of food. And we would look on their rations of a pound of salt pork or a pound of beef and these hard ship's biscuits and maybe a gallon of small beer as very, very unpalatable food. But compared to the food that most standard workmen were eating during the day in the 18th century, this was considered a very good meal. Not everything they're eating on board ship we would recognize as a complete meal, and some of these were very simplistic. One of the great examples of this is burgoo of the 18th century, and a burgoo on board ship is basically a kind of oatmeal. And again, you can see how if you had to feed 200 men, a giant vat of oatmeal might be exactly what you wanted to be able to cook. Burgoo is one of the simplest dishes for the ship's cook to prepare. He's just going to get his cauldron of water nice and hot and then start pouring in his ground oatmeal. And this is something that is not only popular on board ship, but it's standard fare for just about everyone. Ship's biscuit is what Cochrane is trying to replace. This is the mainstay of the diet of a normal sailor in this time frame. And this is so popular that they would have literally thousands of pounds of ship's biscuit on board ship. This would have a lot of different problems though. It had to be made on shore months at a time. And it would come in giant bags that they would have to keep dry on board ship. And that can be difficult to do. So they would have special tin-lined bread rooms to keep the rats out. And even then, they were attacked by weevils. So many times your ship's biscuit would be full of worms, when it was time for you to eat them. Ship's Biscuit also took up a lot of room compared to just plain flour. So Cochrane said, maybe we can actually take up a lot less room if we just had kegs of flour and you could bake soft bread on board ship instead of using these hard biscuits. Ship's Biscuit are also not just edible right away. You just can't eat these. You'll break your teeth immediately. They have to be soaked. Now, some sailors thought this was the only kind of bread to eat, and soft bread would actually mess up your stomach. So they would complain about soft bread and want hard biscuits instead. These biscuits were very handy in situations where you could not cook on board ship. If you have a storm and you can't light your stove, you could feed your sailors and they could sustain themselves on nothing but ship's biscuits. I found it very interesting that his concept of using the old dough technique or the leaven technique to make fresh bread on board ship does not take over. It does not get popular in the least. In fact, it kind of goes the other direction. That ship's biscuit continues to be used for 100 years, even more after this book is printed. And even this old dough technique, sourdough, kind of goes out of favor in the 19th century because the industrialization of the yeast process. So yeast starts to become available in little cakes and in dried yeast. So most of the bread bakers, even in Europe, change over to manufactured yeast. Regardless, it's great to dig into these historical documents to understand what people were thinking in the time period, what was actually popular. So he tells us, even though, he wants to change it to something else, we understand what is popular in the time period and what happens to some of these people's ideas. We've got a couple of different sailor meals here. We've got the burgoo, which is, so much a standard meal. And you can imagine this might be the big meal of the day for a sailor. And this is all they're going to have. A little bit of molasses just to sweeten it up. And then a plain, wonderful oatmeal. I'm not sure how I could work all day and that's the only thing I would eat, but sometimes that's what happened. And now we have the big kind of conclusion here. The bread that Cochrane thinks they should have on board versus the bread they did have on board. And let me tell you, ship's biscuit is tough stuff. You can only eat it without doing any kind of preparation by breaking it into tiny little pieces and sticking them in your mouth and sort of letting them dissolve over maybe a half an hour. This one's been soaking and it's certainly soft enough to eat. But this has been soaking for probably more than an hour, and it's still kind of tough. A bread that is hard to believe anyone could survive upon. Cochrane's bread, no, it doesn't have really big voids in it. It's not your classic white bread. It's a little dense because of the way you would have to make it and how the leaven works. And if we tried this over weeks at a time, it would probably be, a good bit fluffier. But I can understand a meal with this as your kind of bread. But how would you ever, on board ship, ever be able to make enough loaves? You would need a loaf like this per man per day. You would need to have huge ovens or spend your entire day and even night baking bread in one of these little tiny ovens. He talks about redesigning the oven to make them bigger, but even then, I can't imagine it would ever work out. And maybe that's one of the reasons why this was never adopted in the Navy.
Oysters were eaten by everyone in 18th century America. You will see them at the richest homes, you will see them in the poorest settings. In fact, there are times when oysters are even a survival food and is the only thing that people seem to be eating to stay alive. I want to be 100% clear right now at the beginning of this episode and say, I don't know a whole lot about oysters. I grew up in Indiana and Kentucky, and we are far from the ocean. Now, I know a lot of you folks grew up on the ocean, and you probably grew up eating oysters all the time, and this is not exotic to you, but for me, I get to eat oysters today, and I'm super excited about it. We go back to the original colonies, and they're all along the eastern seaboard, so people are very familiar with oysters. It's a saltwater shellfish, and they are eating them a lot. Chesapeake Bay is even said to have had So many oysters that they were thick as stones. And they were so plentiful that ships had to be aware of them when they were coming in, because they would almost create like walls or like tunnel shapes within the water. But before Europeans ever come here, there are Native Americans and they are eating oysters. There are a lot of readings about how they ate so many that when Europeans showed up, there were just these mounds of shells that had collected, and they assumed that they'd collected outside of Native American huts or villages, but they're just almost like these mini little mountains of oyster shells that have just piled up over the years from people living off of them. The Indians who inhabited the coast before the arrival of the Europeans have made oysters and other shellfish their chief food. And at present, whenever they come to a salt water where oysters are to be got, they are very active in catching them and sell them in great quantities to other Indians who live higher up in the country. For this reason, you see immense numbers of oyster and mussel shells piled up near such places where you are certain that the Indians formerly built their huts. So it's not common in the time period also for people to have an understanding of there are different oyster banks where getting oysters is really easy. And so even if you're just kind of on a boat or on a ferry and you're going past one, oftentimes you could just stop to collect oysters. In fact, there was a reading that I came across the other day where somebody was on a ferry and there had been kind of an altercation. So the ferry driver or captain wanted to kind of make it up to him. He's like, listen, we're going past this oyster bank. I'll have my guys hop up and they'll get you a bunch of oysters and I'll make everything all right. We think about oysters now. A lot of times we think about oysters on a half shell. And so whether cooked or not cooked, we're going to pop those suckers open and we're going to eat them right out of the shell. Sometimes you're going to throw a sauce in there, sometimes just a little bit of hot sauce. Sometimes you're going to make something like oysters Rockefeller where it's baked or broiled and it's this special thing. In the time period, there was a lot of that going on too, but they were also using oysters and they were making one-pot dishes with them. They were making like a stew or something like that. And this recipe today is a ragu of oysters. Both of our recipes today are coming from The Complete Housewife by Eliza Smith. This was written in 1730. Put into your stew pan a 1/4 pound of butter, let it boil. Then take a quart of oysters, strain them from their liquor and put them to the butter. Let them stew with a bit of shallot shred very fine and some grated nutmeg and a little salt. Then beat the yolks of 3 or 4 eggs with the oyster liquor and 1/2 pound of butter. Shake all of this well together till it is thick and serve it up with sippets and garnish with sliced lemon. To make this ragu of oysters, first you're going to have your oysters shucked. And when you do that, you're going to save all of the liquid that comes out of the shell and you're going to put that into a bowl. And then we're going to get our butter into a pan. We're going to get that melted down. We're going to put in the oysters, some finely cut shallots, some salt and some nutmeg, and we're going to let that stew a little while. Now, once that's stewed, you're going to take it off the heat so that it cools a little bit. Now, it doesn't have to cool down all the way, but the next step uses eggs, and we don't want to cook those eggs when we pour it into that liquid. In a separate dish, we're going to put 3 or 4 egg yolks, and we're going to combine that with butter and some of the liquid from the oysters. Now, depending on how much yours have in them, you're just going to have to eye that. And you're going to stir that all together, and then you're going to combine that with what is already in the pan. Now, this is the tricky part because we don't want to cook those eggs. These eggs are here to be a thickening agent. At the end of this process, after you kind of combine that and heated it up, you're going to make sure that you continue to stir it so that you don't cook the eggs, and then you're going to have this nice, thick, rich, yellow sauce of this flavor from the shallots and this egg yolk and the butter, and that's going to go into the dish with these oysters and be a wonderful sauce as we put that onto our sippets. Now, let's talk about oysters. Like I said earlier, I'm not from the East Coast. I'm not from anywhere, any coast. And I don't know a whole lot about oysters. Today was the first time that I have ever really cooked with oysters, and shucking them can be a little bit difficult. Now, obviously, like anybody that is alive now, I went onto YouTube and I was like, how do you shuck an oyster? And what I found out is it seems like it's a lot easier with a shucking knife, which I don't have. So if you use a paring knife or something small, you have to be careful because you can cut yourself like I did. Basically, there's this little notch back here and you want to get your knife in there and you want to pry that open. And then after you get that kind of loosened up, you'll feel it when it pops. You have a section right up here on the oyster where you're going to want to cut it away from the shell. Then you can get the top shell off, and then you'll cut it off of the bottom shell, and it'll be free. Now for this recipe, you want to save all the contents within the shell, so you might do it over a bowl or something like that. And if you get some shell flakes in there, then you can take those out later. We've talked a little bit about how the wealthy and the poor alike were eating oysters, and it was very common. I found a reading that drives that home a little bit more. It also talks about where the best oysters are found and even how to use the shells. It is likewise a common rule here that oysters are best in those months which end with an R in their name, such as September, October, etc. But that they are not so good in other months. However, there are poor people who live all year long upon nothing but oysters with bread. Over and over again, you see that people are using oyster shells and they're burning that down so that they can use it for creating housing, walkways, all sorts of different kind of structural uses, but they don't prefer it to stones. And so it kind of falls out of favor. People use it in a pinch. Some places you'll even find readings where they're talking about how their housing that they've built with lime from oyster shells just doesn't seem to hold up the way that they want it to. And even there was this one reading that was like, 3 days before it rains, the walls just seem to get really wet. And so they didn't like it for that purpose. Oysters tend to be one of those things that you want to pop the shell open and use them immediately, but we do see a lot of pickling of oysters happening in these cookbooks where they're basically creating a solution with water and the liquor from the oysters themselves, and they're packing them into crocks, and they're boiling that hot, and they're sealing them close. So it would be very similar to pickling anything else in the time period, but they'll store for a while. We also see references to Native Americans smoking oysters where they would take the oyster and they would put the shell directly on the coals and they would smoke them and preserve them that way. One of the huge questions in the comments section, or when we run into people that they ask us about this channel, is what did people eat as tavern fare? When they're at taverns, inns, and coffee houses, what are they eating? What's the convenient food? And the answer, a lot of times, is oysters. Archaeological digs have found serious piles of oyster shells outside of where taverns and coffee houses once were. And this is fare that they were eating while they were sipping on their beers. The point where it was like peanuts now or chicken wings now. This is in food. This is tavern food. And it is really interesting to think not only were they doing that in a half shell kind of situation or cooking them till they opened, but they're also doing it in one pot dishes. They're making soups and they're making stews, but oysters are cheap food. And so rather than using a cut of beef, they're making oysters and they're serving it to their clientele. And there were even, it is so popular that there were even places that were referred to as oyster taverns. We call them oyster bars. And that became more of a thing in the 19th century, but it certainly did exist in the 18th century. I've got another recipe, speaking of tavern food, from Eliza Smith. It's the same book as the last recipe. And I just want to do this real quick because it seems so much fun. It seems kind of like what we think of as tavern fare, and it's fried oysters. And there's nothing more tavern food than take this meat, fry it, and let me eat it while I sip a beer. So we're going to do this. It's really quick and it's really simple. We're going to crack some eggs, put it into a mixing bowl, and we're going to get the consistency right. They just want a thick batter, right? And so we're going to put in some flour and some breadcrumbs, and there aren't any true amounts here. We're looking for a thick batter. We're going to put some salt and some nutmeg, coat our oysters in it, and get it to fry in some animal fat. I'm going to use lard today. I think this demonstrates the full spectrum of what we're talking about here. This is a dish where you're just kind of like throwing it in this batter and frying it. And then here is this nice sauce with lots of butter and eggs, lemon slices, a very nice dish. So I'm going to start off with the fried oysters. We're going to see what they taste like, and then we'll move on here. I don't think there's anything very special about that. I could have used more salt and nutmeg for sure. There wasn't enough seasoning. It's just kind of plain, kind of bland. Now this, I don't think there's going to be anything bland about this at all. That is something special. That is really good. It's really, really rich. The lemon kind of cuts it with some acidity. It's very meaty. There's a good amount of fat there. I mean, it's just like, it's special. That's a really good dish. This is one of the best dishes that I've cooked in this kitchen. If I can do it, a boy from Indiana, then you can do it at home too, and you have got to try this dish. Food has changed so much since the 18th century. If somebody who's not used to looking at these cookbooks just grabs one off a shelf, it'll kind of blow your mind. Even recipes are written out extremely differently than they used to be. We're using different ingredients. Our meals look different. For rich people in the time period, meals were very extravagant. And nowadays, they're a lot more simplified. And for poor folks, or even just working class folks, our meals are definitely elevated since the 18th century. When you have a modern palate and you look at a cookbook from the 18th century, your immediate thought is, these ingredients don't go together. You really have to stretch to think, why would they put that with that? I would never make a dish like that. And then you come into this kitchen, and for educational purposes, we go through and like, I don't care what my mind says works. I'm gonna try exactly what they said. And we are surprised every single time. We have very rarely cooked something in this kitchen that we did not like. So it's hard for us to imagine a dinner or a supper being something that is just vegetables and maybe bread, or liquid and bread, or cheese and bread. They did that all of the time. And today's dish is not that simple, but it's definitely using ingredients that I never would have thought to put together. And I never would have said, this is gonna be a complete meal. My family's gonna be happy after they eat this and go to bed with a full belly. Today's recipe is onion pie, and onion pie was an extremely popular dish in the time period. You see it in multiple cookbooks, some of the very popular cookbooks. This recipe comes from Primitive Cookery, and that was a cookbook that was made for households of less means. And so you would basically take cheap ingredients and then get something in that dish to kind of bring it up and make it feel a little bit more homey, a little bit more rich. This recipe is using some very low ingredients. We're gonna go throw some butter in there to make a nice pie crust, and that's gonna bring the whole thing up. It even uses butter interspersed where you might not usually see that, just to make the recipe feel a little bit more rich. Now, these ingredients are pretty common ingredients for the time period. You would probably be able to find them at a market. If you lived in a community, it would not be hard to get your hands on these ingredients, even if you didn't grow them all. We're talking onions, apples, eggs, potatoes, butter, and flour. Everybody can make this dish, then and now, and it is delicious. So let's talk about eating food in a community of people real quick. In 1797, The Seaman's Guide is written by John Cochrane. And in that book, he's talking about how it seems like the entire British cooking system is based off of baking. But the problem is that they don't all have ovens. And so he's got this idea because he's been up to Quebec and he knows what earthen ovens are. And he's trying to bring that back to England and implement people using earthen ovens. It's not really catching on, but at any rate, there are some ways to bake at home, like a Dutch oven is something that people would use. But oftentimes you would go to the local baker. And the local baker, while he's baking his bread and making his other wares that he's going to sell, he will also put your pie or your loaf in his oven and cook it for you. So if you're living in a community, you have the plus side of having this local baker. In a way, it's almost a communal oven that the whole community is able to use. Now he owns it and he'll do the baking for you, but you can make your pie, you can take it to him, he'll bake it, you can come back and get it, and you don't have to have an oven at home, which is a really, really neat way that the communities just thrive together. Like I said before, this cookbook, Primitive Cookery, it was made specifically for people of lower means. Now, in a lot of the cookbooks that are not necessarily written for people of lower means, they were well aware of the problem of poverty. And they were trying their best to make sure that people that weren't able to get the finest ingredients could still have really good food. They're still including recipes that are like fake versions. Like, this will get you most of the way there recipes. And I think that that's really neat. I think that it's neat that even outside of people that were specifically writing for that purpose, people have that in mind, and they're trying their best to make sure that people that are not able to get all the ingredients that they could possibly want are still eating really good food. One last thought on primitive cookery before I read the recipe. It's also called the Kitchen Garden Displayed, and it focuses a lot on vegetables. If you are looking for a time period book that teaches about cooking with more vegetables, maybe you're a vegetarian, it's not quite vegetarian, but it's almost there, and this is a really great book for you to try. Now, the recipe to make onion pie. Wash and pare some potatoes and cut them in slices. Peel some onions, cut them in slices. Pare some apples, slice them. Make a good crust, cover your dish, and lay 1/4 pound of butter all over. Take 1/4 ounce of maize beaten fine, a nutmeg grated, a teaspoonful of beaten pepper, 3 teaspoonfuls of salt, and mix all together. Strew some over the butter, lay a layer of potatoes, a layer of onions, a layer of apples, and a layer of eggs, and so on until you have filled your pie, strewing a little of the seasoning between each layer, and 1/4 pound of butter in bits, and 6 spoonfuls of water. Close your pie and bake it an hour and a half. A pound of potatoes, a pound of onions, a pound of apples, and 12 eggs will do. Okay, so first things first, we're gonna shrink this recipe down a little bit. I've got a family of 6, and we're not gonna eat a 3.5 pound pie. So there's no reason for most people in a modern setting to make a pie this large. But we are still gonna use all these same ingredients. We're just gonna simplify it a little bit. And what's nice about this is, say you get off work and in the modern setting, you are like, oh, I don't wanna cook. I'm gonna go to the grocery store and I'm gonna pick up a frozen lasagna or something like that because, man, it's gonna be a busy night. This is that kind of a dish for the folks in the time period. They can catch all of these ingredients on their way home from work, from a market or from a vendor or something like that. And they're gonna get home, they're gonna throw a pie crust together real quick, slice the stuff up, and throw it in the oven. It is that easy. Now, this recipe requires a bottom and a top pie crust, and don't worry about it. We're gonna make it together. I know pie crust can feel very intimidating. It doesn't have to be. We're going to make it right now. So what we want is flour that is 3 times the amount of butter that we have. I've got 7 ounces of butter, so about 21 ounces of flour. And we're just gonna get that butter in here while it's still cold, and we're gonna start working it into our flour. After we get our butter kind of pinched in and incorporated with our flour, we're gonna add just a little bit of water, and we're gonna work that until it's the right consistency. Then we'll flour our surface and roll it out. After you have your pie crust all rolled out, we're gonna put the bottom crust inside the pan. And at that point, we need to pare the apples and potatoes. We're gonna get those chopped up nicely. We gotta skin our onions and get those chopped up nicely. And then also we need to boil some eggs. And for a single pie like this size, I think that 5 to 6 eggs is gonna do it for you. So you're gonna give those a hard boil, set them off to cool, peel those, and then you're gonna chop those into thin pieces as well. And we're gonna begin to layer these into the pie pan. So first, we're gonna put a little bit of butter at the bottom, and we're gonna do a layer of potatoes. Then we're gonna put in some kitchen pepper, and then we're gonna do a layer of apples. We're gonna do a layer of spices in between each one of these layers. At the very top, you're going to put some butter, and you're gonna put just a little bit of water, a few teaspoons really, it's not very much at all. And then we need to cut some vents in the top crust of our pie after we've placed that on and sealed it all the way around the edges. Let's talk about kitchen pepper really quickly. Kitchen pepper, we have packaged up. It's on the Townsends website if you want to buy it, that we've made for you. Or you can watch the kitchen pepper video that we did on the channel and you can make it yourself. But it's a blend of 6 spices. It's really great. You can use it pretty much in everything. And it's gonna be wonderful in this recipe. Now, while the recipe itself calls for salt, pepper, nutmeg, and mace, kitchen pepper has ginger and salt, has pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove. And it's going to be wonderful in this pie. All right, so our pie is ready to go. Now, if you're cooking this at home, you're gonna wanna set your oven to 350, let that preheat, and then you'll bake this for about an hour. If you have access to an earthen oven or a Dutch oven, that would be a really fun way to make it. We're gonna use a Dutch oven for this pie. With the Dutch oven, we're just gonna kind of keep an eye on it. I think it's gonna take around the same amount of time. I'm guessing an hour, and we're gonna just keep coals on top, have coals at the bottom, and it's gonna turn out wonderfully, hopefully. If you are a historical reenactor who camps at events and cooks, this is the perfect thing for you to make because you're rolling out a pie crust and there's a lot of paring and chopping. The public will get a good demonstration. Plus, none of the ingredients are gonna go bad sitting at camp. I'm about to taste a pie that is made of eggs, apples, onions, and potatoes. I have no idea what this is gonna taste like, but I'm gonna trust that it's good. So let's find out. That's so good. And it shouldn't be. But I think what gets it is the textures are awesome because at this point the potato's soft, right? The apple's got a little bit of crunch, but onions have a ton of crunch, and the egg is really soft and kind of, I don't know, bouncy? Probably a terrible word for it, but it's like, what's going on here? And I like texture in food, so your brain is just kind of like, what the heck am I eating? But it tastes really good the whole time because, I mean, there's a ton of flavor in it. I mean, apple and onion by itself, that does plenty. But you got some fat in there from the egg yolk, you got fat from butter, and you've got this kitchen pepper that's just covering everything. Absolutely wonderful. The early American colonies lined the eastern seaboard of North America. We really hadn't gone very far west, so the densest part of our population were all clustered in cities that were across the Atlantic Ocean seaboard, and fish fueled our economy. To get to this country in the first place, you were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And from the time that your feet stepped off of that ship and onto the soil, you were tied to the Atlantic Ocean. And fishing was a huge industry. We had sailors, we had fishermen, we had people processing and selling fish. So much of the economy was based around fish, and people ate fish like crazy. So being a born and bred Midwest boy, sometimes seafood can seem like a fanciful thing to me. I didn't grow up eating seafood all the time unless it was bluegill or bass caught in the lake down the road or in the river. Crab legs, lobster, clams, mussels, those types of things always seem like this far off kind of extravagant food. And that's not necessarily at all how people nowadays think about it that live in places that seafood is readily available. And it is certainly not how people thought about seafood back in the 18th century. They were eating it all the time, they had it at their disposal, and they could get it anywhere that they wanted. You're going to see seafood at the lowest table and at the highest table. And there are a lot of people that are going to say that things like lobster and crab were always lowly dishes, but we see them on king's plates. We see high people in society eating lobster all the time. I think a lot of it has to do with the preparation. So everybody from the lowest in society to the highest in society, they're eating seafood, and it seems like most of them are eating the same types of seafood, but they're preparing them in vastly different ways. So fish is one of those things, like I said, that's a huge industry, or it's something that Joe Workaday, anybody, can go out to a stream and catch fish for dinner. People were trapping fish, people were using huge nets to catch thousands of fish, and people were using a line with a hook to catch one at a time. And that's happening all over the colonies. One of my favorite books to get an insight into just the day-to-day life of somebody is the Journal of Matthew Paton. In that journal, he talks about fish quite a bit, and it's interesting how he uses fish. He'll oftentimes go fishing with friends, and he'll talk about how sometimes they caught a single fish, they caught a shad, and it was a disappointment. He talks about one time where he went out with a couple buddies, and on hook and line, they caught 82 fish. And what Matthew Paton would do is he had access to a stream, so he had a fish trap. And I believe that he even took fish that he caught elsewhere and he stored them in this trap. And what he did was use them as currency oftentimes, which is a really interesting way to think about food. Some people have a hard time getting food, and then some people don't have access to a stream where they can get fish. So he oftentimes would pay for goods from his neighbors, or he would borrow, and I know that I say the word borrow here, and it doesn't sound like it's a borrow, it sounds like he's taking a cup of flour. He would take a cup of flour from his neighbor, and then he would take them over a fish. You'll see that a lot in workaday people in the time period. So the working man in our time period is eating what they have at their disposal, and we've talked a lot about William Ellis and how in his book he's talking about farmers. There's not a whole lot of fish mentioned in that because they're growing grain, and he's basing a lot of the diet that he's feeding to these working men off of what they're growing. So if you're not in a place that fish is readily available, then that's not what you're going to be eating. But most of the country had fish at their disposal, and there were a lot of jobs that were tied to that, especially fishermen. And now we'll read a lot of accounts where fishermen, they're not crazy about eating fish. They get tired of it. They don't want that. And so they can get meat and they can get other things, but they're bringing in these vast catches, sometimes 25,000 fish in a day. to bring to the market and sell to other people. And these people are able to get fish whenever they want to. I want to make 3 dishes today, and they're going to be very simple dishes because we're looking at food that the working man is eating. You can find extravagant recipes for all sorts of fish in these cookbooks that we cover, but we're going to take it down to its bare bones today. We're going to do a boiled lobster, a fried shrimp, pan fried, and we're going to do a breaded fried cod. So the first one we're going to use is lobster. Lobster was readily available. People were eating lobster all the time. As we look further and further into the cookbooks, into the journals of the time period, we're seeing that lobster is kind of craved at these high tables and in these high places. I did a recipe not too long ago that was for a lobster fricassee, and that is a very extravagant, expensive dish. For this lobster, we're simply going to boil a lobster tail. That would have been for anybody in the time period would be able to afford that. They can catch lobsters, they can put it in boiling water. It's that easy and it's delicious. So just like any other crop, you catch a lot of fish, and what are you gonna do with that fish to make it last for a long time? You're going to preserve it. And that is the plight of the working man. The working man is feast and famine, right? We've got a bounty here. Now we've got to stretch this, and that's happening with fish just like anything else. Now I found this book called A Treatise of Fishing, Herrings, Cod, and Salmon, How to Cure and Preserve Them. It was written in 1800, and really it was collected in 1800 because it's really just they're begging and borrowing from a lot of different texts that they found. But it was really interesting because it had methods of preserving salmon in more countries than I thought salmon even existed in. This covers Canada, China, England, Scotland, Holland, Russia, Sweden, and Germany. It's just crazy. I didn't even know the salmon was plentiful in all of those places. But how all of these different people are preserving them. They talk about how the Canadians, they have the ability to just keep them frozen for long periods of time throughout the winter, and they'll last just fine. And then they talk about drying fish. They talk about salting fish. Some people would just leave their fish out in the sun to dry, and that was a very common method. Salting fish. We have salt cod sitting right here, and we've covered a lot with salting in the past, but you'll salt this to preserve it, and then you'll soak it numerous times to help get the salt out of there, and then you can use it as food later on, after months after you thought that you would be able to. We talk about potted salmon, and we've covered that on the channel before, where you're basically taking your salmon and you're submerging it in clarified butter, and that's sealing off the top in sort of a canning method. So all of these people are catching this fish, and they're keeping it maybe in live tanks, maybe freezing, and maybe even they're having to preserve it in pots. They're pickling it, they're drying it, and they're salting it, which is really interesting because we don't have to do that in America these days. We have deep freezes, and it's really easy for us to keep our food. But these folks, they had to think about the whole year. They constantly planned ahead, and that is the plight of the working man. We're also going to do a shrimp recipe today, and by recipe, it's a very loose recipe, right? We're gonna take some butter and we're gonna put it in the pan. You're gonna need to devein and deshell your shrimp. Mine are already done. Then you're gonna throw them in the pan, and you're just gonna get them in a little heat. They don't take long to cook. Keep them on one side until it starts to turn a little bit of pink, then you turn it on the other side. It just takes a few minutes, but man, is it a delicious dish. So this is a reading that I found. There was actually somebody that was researching the monuments of Ireland, but what he had to say about shrimp was really interesting. He said, "And the shrimp are of a sweet and tender flesh, restorative and hectic, and esteemed more delicate and wholesome than lobsters or oysters. They are eaten boiled in water or fried." I think it's really interesting that they thought that shrimp beat out lobsters and oysters in this particular scenario. I don't think that you would see that in a whole lot of scenarios now today. I mean, if you go into a seafood restaurant, oysters and lobsters, they're at the top of the menu. They're king. That's top shelf food. Shrimp can be pretty lowly. So I just thought that was really interesting. So speaking of preserving fish, one thing that we've talked about on the channel is stockfish. I found this book, it's called The Seaman's Guide. We've used it on the channel. It was written in 1797, and it's basically a book where they're talking about living comfortably at sea. And I thought that this reading was really fun, so I'd bring it to the channel. At one period, it was customary to give stockfish in India ships, but was not found to answer. The original cost was dear, requiring an allowance of oil, mustard, and vinegar. And the trouble it took in preparing and beating disgusted the men so much that at least half of it was thrown overboard. The best fish to carry to sea would be herrings, but they must be cooked in the same manner now practiced by the poor people in Scotland. They soak it in water until they become pretty fresh. They are then hung up in the sun and wind on a stick through the eyes to dry, and then boiled or broiled. In this way they eat almost as well as if they were new caught. That sounds really yummy, doesn't it? And the last dish that we're going to do today is cod, and you can do this with perch, you can do this with all sorts of fish. So we're going to take our fillet, it's going to be wet, we're going to dry it off a little bit, and we're going to put it in the flour, get flour on both sides with a little bit of salt and pepper, and then we're going to put it in the pan with butter, and we're going to fry it until it's done. Fish does not take long to cook. You don't want to overcook it, you want to watch it. Each side's going to turn golden brown, and it's going to have a nice flaky white fish inside. The fishing industry in our time period is massive. Some of it crosses over with just general sailing. There are people that are building ships or repairing ships, making sails, repairing sails, and that crosses over into spice trade or naval ships. That's what is happening. The ocean is the superhighway. But at the same time, very specifically, there are people that are making fish nets, and they're making them on a massive scale or a very small scale. There are people that are making fish line and fish hooks. You've got oyster shuckers and fishmongers who are barely above the poverty line or maybe below the poverty line, but they're still working in that fish trade. It is covering the society from the lowest to the highest, and it is very, very plentiful. You look at this plate and you think, man, that looks good, and it looks like it's a fancy upper class plate. And I think that that keeps happening more and more, where food that we're going to eat now in fine restaurants is kind of working class food of the time period, and we just keep seeing that trend. Really, this would have been available to anybody. There was a working class family in the time period that we're discussing, and it looks delicious. Let's give it a try. We're going to try a piece of this lobster first. I dug a little bit out. It's going to be sweet. It's not buttery. I don't have that fine butter sauce that we're used to dipping lobster into because we're trying to stay cheap on this. But man, is it good, especially with a little bit of lemon on there. All right, we've got some fried cod, just flour, salt, and pepper. That's great. That flour got way crispier on the outside than I thought it would. Nice flaky white fish on the inside. Wonderful. All right, now we're gonna try this shrimp, and I know that this shrimp got a lot of lemon juice on it. I'm really excited to try it. It's just pan fried in butter. What can go wrong? I love shrimp. This is so good. This is the working man's seafood. It is delicious. You should try it at home.
What is the real cornbread? If you ask people around the United States today, you will get so many different answers. Cornbread has to be sweet, or it has to be made out of white cornmeal or yellow cornmeal. Maybe it can't have sugar in it, or it has to be a particular shape. But my question is, what is the real cornbread from 250 years ago or 300 years ago? Now, I know you're already jumping into the comment section telling us what your cornbread is. And for me, I grew up in northern Indiana, so cornbread is yellow, and for me personally, it came out of a little blue box. Cornbread is a dish of the Americas. Depending on how you look at it, cornbread has been made for literally thousands of years by the Native Americans. But what about when European settlers come to the New World? They have their own idea of exactly what bread is. Now, that can be a diverse answer, but most people think of bread as wheaten bread. It's a large, fluffy loaf, and they come to the Americas and they don't have wheat. It doesn't grow well here, at least right off the bat, and so they have to work with Native American corn. Native American corn does not easily turn into something like wheaten bread. It is just not made of the right kind of stuff. The lack of gluten within the corn really doesn't allow the yeast anything to work upon, so you don't get these wonderful nice air pockets inside of your bread. Now, interestingly, even within Great Britain, there were regions and cultures that had different main grains that grew there. So barley in some place, oats in another area, or rye. Now, these grains don't make very good bread either. And the people that grew those grains in those particular regions wanted bread, and they had to make a bread substitute with those. And they usually had to make do with oat cakes or barley cakes, something that most people wouldn't consider as bread. But those people that lived in those regions, they actually liked those types of bread better than wheaten bread generally, unless they wanted to look like they were upper class or middle class people that could afford the more expensive wheat bread. Exactly the same thing happens in North America. Corn doesn't make regular bread, and so people end up making Johnny cakes or maybe hoe cakes. These are just little flat cakes, which we wouldn't call bread at all. Very flat, kind of grainy, and with a very distinct taste. Now, most people still wanted real bread. How did they make real bread with corn? Now, there certainly is a distinction between cornbread and bread made with corn. These Europeans are looking for bread, the kind of normal bread they're used to, and so they're going to be making a bread made with some corn. But generally it's made with a combination of other grains, usually wheat or possibly rye, sometimes all three. When we look at the descriptions, and descriptions are all we have these simple ideas of, well, they made their bread with corn and wheat and rye, or they made their bread with corn and wheat. Sometimes they say they made their bread with just corn. But no matter how you try to make bread with just corn, it really doesn't turn out to be anything like what they would call bread. As ubiquitous as bread made with corn was in the 18th century, the funny thing is we really don't have any recipes for it. There are no American cookbooks from the 18th century except for Amelia Simmons's little cookbook from 1796-97. And corn is used in this little cookbook, but never does she make anything that we would call cornbread or even bread at all. She does have a recipe for Johnny cakes. So there's something like a little flat cornbread, but we have to look at other works to even get a concept for what their bread made with corn was like. Our first real recipes that we get for bread made with corn or something like cornbread comes in the 19th century. In The Art of Bread, in 1804, we have a maize bread recipe. And this one is a description of bread, or a recipe for bread, that really meets the description all through the 17th and 18th century about how they basically made their bread with corn. The recipe reads like this. Take a peck of the meal of maize, mix it up with water, and boil it over a fire till it comes to the consistency of paste. Then take a peck of wheat flour and knead both together with a proper proportion of salt and yeast into a dough. Allow it to stand before the fire for 2 hours to ferment, and then divide it into loaves and put them in the oven. Pretty simple recipe. It's almost as simple as regular bread, but with the corn, we have to boil it up into basically a cornmeal mush, and then we mix that with our wheat, and that will turn into something like, well, what we would consider cornbread. Now, we're not going to make a giant recipe here. We just need to boil 1 cup of cornmeal in a little bit of water. We want to boil it in just enough water that we get a nice thick paste. This will take a little bit of time, so stir it the entire time or it'll burn on the bottom of the pan. We're going to allow this paste to cool off. I'm just going to spread it around this bowl, and then we can mix it with our wheat flour. And I'm going to use just 1 cup of wheat flour here. I'll use a whole wheat flour, and we're going to knead this together. It's going to create a very, very loose dough, and we can mix that with a little bit of yeast. I've got a little liquid yeast here and some salt. Once we've got this mixed up, we can put it right into something like a pie pan Or if you want a loose loaf, you can also do that, but it's going to spread out. So the best way to really bake this is to bake it in some sort of a pan, either a little square pan or a pie pan like I've got here. I would let this rise for about an hour. It will kind of puff up a little bit, give it room to grow, and you can bake this, I would say, in a pie pan, something like 35 or 45 minutes at about 400 degrees. Now, can we make cornbread without any flour? Yes. A little bit later, we have The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph. This is 1824, and she makes a cornmeal bread. She says, rub a piece of butter the size of an egg into a pint of cornmeal. Make it into a batter with 2 eggs and some new milk. Add a spoonful of yeast, set it by the fire to rise. Butter little pans and bake it. This recipe seems to be the first one that gives us our classic concept of cornbread as we know it today. We're going to take that butter and rub it into our pint of cornmeal. We're going to add in 2 eggs and some new milk. Now, new milk, we probably just want to use regular whole milk in this case. Again, a spoonful of liquid yeast. A regular packet of yeast is going to work fine for this. We're going to set it by the fire to rise and bake it in those smaller tins. This is the real cornbread from 250 years ago. It doesn't look like bread, does it? It doesn't look like your standard loaf of bread. It's flat. Even when I tried to get it to become a loaf, this is as much as you could possibly get out of it. In fact, there is one reference where they talked about making it and they would basically pile it up on the thing and it would kind of flatten out like this, and then they would put more on top of it and let it bake, and then put more on top of it and let it bake to try to build it up. It doesn't work very well. But if we're here just for taste, then let's find out what it tastes like. So I've got this one. This is the half and half that has wheat flour and cornmeal in it and yeast, and that's it. That's all there is to it. It kind of looks like it has a typical cornbread texture to it, and it does have some leavening in there. It's not just super dense, and it smells a lot more bready than you might expect. It does have a cornbread smell, but you know, and it's very, very flavorful compared to bread that we eat today. You know, even a whole wheat loaf doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it. You put butter on it, you put other things on it. Bread by itself, other than the crust, doesn't have a lot of flavor. This is like crust all the way through, flavor-wise. You don't really end up with a true crust on it like you would a crusty bread. So this is the typical cornbread from 300 years ago. Now, if we go to the later cornbread, this is probably closer to what we would consider a cornbread, the Virginia Housewife. It doesn't have as bready a texture. This holds together as almost a bread. This is a lot more crumbly. I think it's a lot more like what we would consider some kinds of cornbread today. A little grittier, you know. Compared to so many cornbreads that you might have today, whether it's made from scratch or it's made out of a box, the trouble to go to make this one is definitely worth it. There are times when the only way to survive is to forage, to find food in the wild, wherever you can find it. But it takes special knowledge. There are many, many times in history when we look at different journals in the 18th century and we find people that at the edge of survival have to go out and find their food. Somebody like Nicholas Creswell or the Lewis and Clark expedition. They are in the worst kind of circumstances. Maybe they're at the end of winter and there's no real food left. Or they're in the wilderness and they're traveling or they're exploring and they're out of supplies. You read about this over and over again. And that last bit of energy they use to find food that will sustain them until they get to civilization. Foraging is an interesting kind of word that I think sometimes we can have a hard time really narrowing in on and understanding its true meaning. Many times in the 18th century, Forage was used for the military, and when they foraged, it was basically pillaging. They had to get supplies, and they would just kind of break into farms and take what they needed. Sometimes they would pay for those supplies, other times not so much. And there was official foraging and unofficial foraging. We have people like Joseph Plum Martin. He occasionally just has to go and steal to survive. Maybe we could call it gleaning in the fields. He would just go to the edge of a field and, take a few pumpkins, whatever it took so that he could survive. He wasn't taking them to sell them. He just needed to eat something. And then other kinds of foraging, that's where you're finding the bounty in the wild. You go out into the woods, you go out into the meadows, and you find what food there is. Sometimes it's greens, maybe it's tubers, something like a wild carrot, and you'll survive upon that. Right now is a perfect example. It's spring outside and things are just starting to get green. The weather gets warm and it feels great, but it's in fact the hardest time of year for some people on the frontier because they are out of supplies, and yet what's out there isn't going to give them anything. They haven't planted any crops yet. There's nothing there to harvest, to eat, and what they have left over from winter is either run out or it's bad. It's gone bad by now, especially with the warmer weather. So you think winter's the hardest, spring is actually the hardest time of year. Now, there are times when we forage today, and we usually forage today for delicacies, something like a morel mushroom. But the kind of foraging that we're usually talking about in the 18th century is survival foraging. And therefore, what you're trying to get there is actual sustaining food. And it might not be pleasant. It might not be even palatable at times, but it's what you truly need to survive. Who cares about one tiny yummy mushroom when you're going to starve to death and you need to fill your stomach and actually have something that's truly nutritious? Helke Welder is talking about living in this very, very difficult primitive frontier situation, and he has plenty of fish, but he says, ew, they're totally unpalatable, and it's not food that can sustain the body. And so he survives upon nettles, something that is much more nutritious. Not something necessarily good to eat, but something that can truly sustain the body. How do we prepare our foraged foods? There are times when the best kind of foraged food is something we don't need to prepare at all. We can eat it raw, even if it might be unpalatable, but most things are going to get cooked at least a little bit. Usually in a foraging situation, we have only the simplest cooking tools. So can we boil it? Can we fry it? While some things you can eat right away, maybe even raw, there are other things that you forage that unless they're prepared in just the right way, are actually poisonous. So you need kind of special knowledge for that. And that brings us to that idea of special knowledge. Foraging is all about information and knowledge about where you're at and what there is available. We get to this great example of Sacagawea with the Lewis and Clark expedition. They couldn't survive that entire trip, even though they had all these supplies and all these equipment. They couldn't survive without the specialized knowledge that she had. Not only was she able to talk to the Native Americans and translate for them, but she had the knowledge to understand what they could forage in the land and survive upon when there was no hunting and there were no supplies available. There was one point where they needed to decide where to camp for a long-term camp for winter before they left to come back. They used her knowledge to locate their camp in the right location so that they would have forage materials right next to them. So they would have a special kind of tuber that grew in the ground that she knew about that they had no idea. Without that knowledge, they wouldn't have been able to survive. Another great example of this specialized knowledge is Nicholas Creswell as he goes into the wilderness on his second trip. And he is going to trade with the Native Americans. He gets separated from his guide and he's alone and he loses his horse. He doesn't have any real supplies with him, but he runs into a couple of Native Americans and they help him. They find his lost horse and they give him food. they didn't have any trouble finding what it took to survive in the world around them. They were completely away from civilization or any kind of camp, but they knew exactly what it took to survive. When it comes to foraging, each region has its own specialty. And right here, nettles are one of the most prolific things at this time of year. Right now, if you go outside, almost everything is still brown, but we have just a few green things popping up. Some of those are highly nutritious, and stinging nettles are one of those things. Stinging nettles were highly popular in Europe at the time, mostly for medicine, but they used them for other purposes too. And here they're the perfect food in early March. A great example of using nettles is Heckewelder, and he is traveling in the backcountry of Pennsylvania. He is traveling in the middle of the 18th century, and he's a missionary. And he wants to be a mission to these Native Americans, but they don't want him to set down roots there. They're worried about people settling in the frontier. They allow him only a piece of ground 50 paces by 50 paces to have his garden, and they have to figure out how to survive in that location with that much ground. And it's not even good ground to grow in, it's actually a forest, so they have to cut down the trees. So they know there is absolutely no way they can survive on that piece of ground. So he has to forage. There are no locations that he can get supplies from that are close to him, and so he has to survive on the wilderness. We lived mostly on nettles, which grew abundantly in the bottoms, and of which we frequently made 2 meals a day. We also made use of some other vegetables and greens. That's what they're living on. Nothing but stinging nettles. So what's the classic way to cook something like a whole bunch of greens that you have here, nettles or maybe dandelion? And as I go looking through the cookbooks in the 18th century and before, you don't necessarily find a nettle soup recipe. That's not something people are generally talking about in a fancy cookbook that we have in our time period. But we do have many, many interesting examples of medicinal and just plain sustaining broths. We'll take a meat, maybe a beef, and we boil that and then chop up our herbs very fine, our greens, and put them into boil. And there are different recipes here they talk about. It's like, well, use what greens you have available. And they give you this list of 20 or 30 different kinds of herbs to use. And nettles are one of them, and so are dandelions. I'm going to be making a wonderful sustaining broth today. I'm going to take about a gallon of water and maybe a half a pound of beef. We're going to use this wonderful 17th century recipe where he talks about using as much chopped up oatmeal as we have herbs, and to chop these herbs up very, very small. What we want this to do is break down completely, so it begins to be a very thick broth. And we have a thick broth with our herbs and our oatmeal, and then some little chunks of meat. I'm always amazed when I dig into these readings about how much perseverance, how much struggle there was, and how they pushed through. I think it's something we can all take a lesson from. So let's find out how our broth turned out. So the greens are hanging out here. They did not break up as much as some of the recipes called for, but I didn't want to cut them up until they disappeared. We've got a little bit of the oatmeal. You don't need a lot, and it really thickens it up. We just boiled it up until it got the right kind of thickness. Of course, the beef looks plenty done here, and really that's just the extra part. The important part, that's the greens. So let's find out. Boy, you would think that stinging nettles would be distasteful, that they would be bad. And it turns out that in this context, they are really, really good. After tasting this, I can see why Heckewelder was eating nettles twice a day and enjoying it.
When we look in period texts and we see rich people food and we see poor people food, they are seemingly miles apart. And in a lot of ways, they could not be more different. When you look at the food that comes to a rich person's table, the presentation, the process, There's a table placement in the beginning of a lot of these cookbooks that says these dishes go here, this dish goes here, silverware goes here. And there's a process in how all that movement takes place. You know that a poor person, not on their best day, is ever going to experience anything like that. Now, we are going to talk about poor people and poor people food in this episode, but we've already done that at length on this channel. Let's focus real quick on the rich person. Rich people in the time period had responsibilities that poor people did not have, or at least they thought they did. There was something about looking the part, acting the part, that mattered very much to them, and they felt like it was their responsibility, especially in the new world, to have that appearance because they wanted to seem on par with the places that they had come from. People over in Europe are saying, nah, that it's a new place, it's the wild, it's going to be a bad situation. And they felt it was their responsibility to dispel those rumors and those beliefs. One of the things that I thought was most strange and impressive when I went to George Washington's Mount Vernon was that he didn't have a stone house, but he had painted it to look like a stone house because that was the expectation. So some of those responsibilities made the dinner table one of the most important things in their lives because business is done over the dinner table. Bonds are formed over the dinner table. Relationships are progressed. And that is what rich people needed in society. They needed people in high places to be on their side. So the table at a rich person's house needed to be impressive. It needed to have a wow factor. We might even think about things that we say now when it comes to food like, oh, the presentation is beautiful, you eat with your eyes first. That's very true, and they knew that back then. And so when you go to a rich person's house, food is impressive, it's beautiful, it's plentiful, and it's going to take a long time to consume it because it's about the conversation and the event. Now, it is easy for us to look at this situation and say, oh, that poor rich person, they have to entertain guests. What a hard life. But let's say that this is something that you're born into, something that you didn't ask for. Benjamin Franklin even said that guests, like fish, begin to smell after 3 days. And in his autobiography, he laments sometimes about the fact that he has to entertain or the fact that he has to do different things in high society that he's not drawn to. He's a person that likes to think and invent, and he does like conversation, and he does like meeting with important people. But it doesn't mean that he always wants to. It's a responsibility. It's an obligation. So just like with rich people, food is, in a way, it's a tool, right? They're using it in the way that they best know how to make their situation better, and that is entertainment, entertaining people. With poor people, food is also a tool. It's for sustenance. It's for survival. And depending on whether you are just a poor beggar, there's that, and you need sustenance in that situation. If you're a laborer, you need fuel. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that fuel looks like. In William Ellis's book, A Country Housewife's Family Companion, he talks about farmers, he talks about laborers, and he talks about their diets. And they're raising crop, they're raising livestock. He's saying use this then, use this at a different time in the season, right? And he's kind of laying all that out for us. But mainly what these laborers are eating are grains, vegetables, fruits made into puddings and pasties and different things like that. That's what they're concerned with. As you're reading through these period cookbooks, you start to realize rich people and poor people oftentimes are eating the same thing. Now, when it comes to something like meat, they're eating different cuts, but it's the same animal. And when it comes to something like vegetables, oftentimes they're eating the same vegetables, it's just prepared in a different way. And it's thought of in a different way. So if we take asparagus, for example, that is a really strange sort of vegetable that you'll oftentimes find growing in the wild. In fact, I was just talking to John about this recipe, and he gave me the story about how when he was little, when his mom was driving in the country and she saw asparagus growing somewhere, she would just stop and snip it real quick, take it home and cook it. So poor people could certainly do that. They can have wild asparagus. And when it's in season, that's great. But rich people could have it anytime they want it. They can order things from greenhouses. They have the funds to support that. They can even say, for this dish and the wow factor, I want white or purple asparagus. They have the advantage of being picky about what they want. The poor person is taking what they can get. I've got two recipes today that are using the same main ingredient, and we're gonna make them both. We're gonna look at them and say, what makes this one rich? What makes this one poor? And we're gonna taste them against each other. So the first one comes out of Primitive Cookery, and that was from 1767. And this is an interesting and wonderful little cookbook. It was made so that people that are not of means can have really great food. In the back, it kind of goes through and it lists a bunch of different recipes that have minimal ingredients that you can just whip up. It says asparagus with butter and salt, eaten with bread, purges by urine, and affords good nutriment. It's that simple. We're going to throw some asparagus in the skillet with butter, have a piece of bread, and see how that tastes. Now the second recipe is a little bit more elaborate. It comes from The Art of Cookery, which was written in 1774. So less than 10 years between these two recipes. So we know that the classes are still very similar. We're comparing apples to apples here. All right, here's the recipe. It's called asparagus forced in French rolls. Take 3 French rolls, take out all the crumb, but first cutting a piece of the top crust off. But be careful that the crust fits again in the same place. Fry the rolls brown in fresh butter, then take a pint of cream, the yolks of 6 eggs beat fine, a little salt and nutmeg. Stir them well together over a slow fire till it begins to be thick. Have ready 100 of small grass boiled, then save tops enough to stick the rolls with. The rest cut small and put into the cream. Fill the loaves with them. Before you fry the rolls, make holes thick in the top of the crust. Then lay on the piece of crust and stick the grass in. Then it may look as if it were growing. It makes a pretty side dish for a second course. So this dish is all about presentation. So, okay, we're gonna take this loaf of bread and we're gonna fill it and we're going to brown it up, and we're also going to make it look like there are little asparagus that are growing up through it. It's very whimsical. When it comes to the table, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? And if we've got breadcrumbs here letting us know that this is a rich dish. Number one, it's got nutmeg. Nutmeg is not a cheap ingredient, and it's not something that just everybody has, although they want it. And it is popular in some lower dishes. But that is when people want to feel like, oh, we've got something special here. Number two, we've got eggs and cream as opposed to just butter. Number three, it says right here at the end of the recipe, this is a pretty side dish at a second course. There's so much food. This is just a piece of the meal. And the poor one, it's the whole meal. That's all you get. For our wealthy asparagus dish, what we're going to do is take our asparagus and cut off the ends that are in the ground, and then we're going to boil it. And it won't take long to boil, depending on how brisk it is. You just want it to be to the consistency that you like to eat it at. After that, we are going to take our French roll and we're going to take an angle and we're going to cut into the crust. But we want to make sure that this crust piece that we cut out is going to fit back over the top like a coffin. We basically have walls, a top, and an empty interior. Then we're going to prepare our custard, and we're going to cut this recipe down from what they call for, because we only need 1 French loaf. So we're going to take 3 eggs and a cup of cream. We're going to mix that together with some salt and some nutmeg. Put that over the fire. We're going to cook this slowly. We just want it to thicken up. We do not want to cook the eggs. You want to keep 4 or 5 pieces of the top of the stalks that are a bit longer, because that's for our presentation. After we get that mixed up with the custard, we're going to put that inside, and then the top we're going to cut little bits out so that we can stick the asparagus stalks down in there. When that's all done, you put the top back on, and it's completely sealed up as a loaf of bread with asparagus growing out of it. This is what makes me tick about researching these historical recipes. It's one thing, and it is fun to just kind of go through and say, oh, that's an interesting recipe. I want to try that, and I want to taste what they were tasting. It's something completely different, and it's even more fun when you're reading in between the lines culturally, and you're saying, okay, so who was eating what, and why were they doing it, and what mattered about this presentation versus this non-presentation, and seeing where all that fits into society. That stuff I can really just go deep on, and this has been a really fun recipe to research. For our tasting, let's start with the lowly asparagus and work our way up. And I'm guessing, if you've had asparagus before, that's what this is. Right? And thankfully, asparagus is one of my favorite things to eat. The butter is nice. It brings in some richness there. Let's see what this tastes like. So this one actually doesn't have butter, except for on the outside of the bread. But it has this rich custard. Yeah. The rich one it's fun. It's different. It's got more going on. I'd be happy eating either one, but they're both delicious. Obviously, the cream and the eggs in this one makes it more rich. So again, this is a side dish over here. This is a main course. They've gone out of their way to wow you. I mean, look at this presentation. I've never made anything and cared that much about what it looks like. You've got a beautiful plate to put it on as well, but it looks like what they said. Asparagus is growing out of it, and it brings a wow factor up to the table along with it.
Pasta is a very popular dish today, but in the 18th century, it was something that was very new to people in America. Some people were excited about pasta, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, but most people really didn't have very much experience with it. There are a few newspaper advertisements advertising pasta from Italy, but the vast majority of people didn't get to have it. We didn't have the kind of machinery or even the knowledge to understand what pasta really was. Thomas Jefferson spent time in Europe in the late 18th century, and there he had experience with pasta, and he so enjoyed that he wanted to bring that back to America. He had someone go look at pasta machinery, how they made pasta, and he got descriptions, and he even drew diagrams of pasta machines. I want to experience pasta made on a machine just like Jefferson had.
After looking at the painting of Jefferson's pasta press, it seems pretty simple. A hardwood frame with a metal pot that the dough will go into, and then a large wooden screw acting like a vise to press the dough through the holes in the bottom to make little noodles. From the painting, I've come up with a design that's fairly simple. Hardwood posts and rails that are mortise and tenon together. The size we're going to make is a tabletop size. That's all we really need. In larger applications, they were the size of a room and actually used horses and a winch to crank the big wooden screws around to force the noodles out in a mass quantity, a whole lot at once. The measurements that we're going to use to make this is roughly 2 feet by 1 foot, leaving about 6 inches on the bottom for our dish or bowl or whatever we need to catch the pasta when it comes out of the press. The frame is fairly simple, just wooden pieces, mortise and tenon pegged together, but the actual working part of this, what makes it all come together, is the large wooden screw that'll act like the big vise coming down and forcing that pasta through. Now these wooden screws are large, so it's going to be a challenge, but I think I've come up with a nice solution and just the right tools to get the job done. To make the plunger part, we need to turn this on the lathe, and then this whole end here has to be just the right diameter to fit in the screw box to turn this into threads all the way along. And that is done with the screw box. Now in the time period, these screw boxes were matched to the tap. You make the tap, you make the screw box, and they go together. There weren't common sized threads. You couldn't just go to the store and buy one. If you had one made, you had the other made, and they went together all the time. This screw box here has a cutter, and when this piece is turned into it, it'll cut threads, and it'll thread itself all the way through. This is a tap that has an advancing cutter. You need these in order to make both threads for this working piece. We have our screw box, the threads and the cutter on the inside of it, greased up, ready to go. It'll take a little bit of time, but a little bit of patience, and we'll have some nice threads to work with. And we'll just start it in nice and easy by hand. As it gets farther in, it'll get a little tougher. Once the threads start biting, it'll kind of draw itself in. We have our threads cut all the way up to this point, but you notice this piece of wood here, the collar, the threads are only cut up to there. So if we want the threads cut all the way up, we need to back this out, take the collar off, and then run it back down again, and then we can cut the threads all the way up right against this shelf here of the plunger. Our two cross pieces here are both the same size, but one will have a smooth round hole for the cup to sit in. The other one will have a smaller hole that will be threaded, and that's the one that's going to be a challenge. They're both marked on center, so our next step is to bore a hole, and then we can take this tap here that we've made, put it in there, and that'll tap out and make our internal threads. Now the cutter here has a little set screw that can push it up each pass going back and forth through, making that cutter stick out just a little bit more and taking just a little bit more of a cut. Our hole is bored and it will be inserted like this. Then the collar will go right down up against the piece of work. And depending on what kind of work you're doing, if it's fine finish work, you're going to want to clamp this. If it's a rough frame like what we're using, you can use screws. And once it's held into place, we can start driving the tap through. Each pass will make just a little bit more of a cut. And once again, a little bit of patience and persistence, and then you'll have our internal threads. This is kind of the mid-range. This is a cheaper way to make this size of thread as opposed to having an all-metal giant tap to make this size of thread. Here our cutter is just a very small piece, so it's also economical. The bowl is made out of a mild steel, and we had to just hammer the flange over, and we did it cold. As long as you're careful, you can do that and it's just fine. The top flange flanges out so it'll catch into the cross piece of the frame. The bottom flange is flanged in just a little bit so it'll catch the bottom plate that has the holes in it. The bottom plate that fits inside of the inward flange on the bottom of the bowl is made out of steel as well, and I used a jeweler's saw to get a nice fine intricate cuts so we have perfect noodles coming out of the bottom. Now once we get all of these pieces done, we're going to season them just like a cast iron skillet. The final assembly is pretty easy. We have mortise and tenons with wedges, so you put it together, you hammer the wedges tight, but then also if you need to store it away in a tight spot, just knock out the wedges and it packs down pretty small.
The recipe we'll be using to test out this pasta machine is Jefferson's recipe. It goes something like this: 6 eggs, yolks and whites, 2 wine glasses of milk, 2 pounds of flour, a little salt. Work them together without water very well. This should make a softer dough than some of the other recipes. Hannah Glass has a recipe. She says make it really stiff. That's for rolling it out and cutting it. Since we'll be extruding this, it needs to be softer. We're gonna do a half a batch. I'm gonna try whole wheat flour and we'll see how that turns out. I've used it before and it's worked out pretty well. We're gonna mix in a little bit of salt, dry, and I'll just mix this with my hands. And then we'll take 3 eggs and 2/3 of a cup of milk, and we're gonna whisk that together and then pour it into our flour mixture and mix it up with my hands until we get a nice smooth dough. All right, Brandon, you made it. You do the honors.
Alrighty. Well, what I'm expecting to happen is the dough will come out in the shapes here that we cut out. One little problem that we might run into is if it squeezes up out of the top here, but depending on the consistency of the dough, we'll see. It might work out.
It does look like a pretty good fit, so.
We've got some squeezing action.
Let's do it. It's looking good. So I didn't know exactly how they were gonna come out, and it probably depends on the dough as to what the consistency is like. They do wanna naturally curl, but I wanna go ahead and slice them up a little bit and curve them so that we get some elbow on them. William Short wrote to Thomas Jefferson on February 2nd, 1789, I procured at Naples, according to your request, the mold for making macaroni. It is of a smaller diameter than is used in the manufactories of macaroni, but of the same diameter with the others that have been sent to gentlemen in other countries. I went to see the macaroni made. The machinery for pressing as used at Naples is enormous. The price they told me for fitting up one of these machines with a mortar, etc., was the value of 100 louis d'ors. The depth of the mortar is about 20 or 24 inches. I observed that the macaroni most esteemed at Naples was smaller than we generally see at Paris. This is the part of Italy the most famous for the excellence of that article. We had one of the best cooks in Naples, and yet he never could give us macaroni that we thought edible. Brandon, thanks again for making that incredible pasta machine. This, I hope, turned out great. I mean, I haven't tried this particular pasta recently, but it smells really good and that cheese melted really nice, so it should have an amazing flavor. Let's find out. Oh, those are some chunky noodles, let me tell you. Woo, so good. And if you make it like this, don't forget the nutmeg. It really sets it off. So good, so good. Thanks again, Brandon.
Many times throughout history, we see examples where an entire people group are basing their diet almost completely off of a single ingredient. Sometimes that's because it's the only thing that will grow in this particular geographical area, or sometimes it maybe is just the most cost-effective way that they can feed their family. But what happens if that ingredient suddenly disappears? In our world today, we have famine, we have crop failure, we have climate variations, and we have periods of time where the food that we're growing is not growing the way that it normally does. But we also have figured out over the last couple hundred years different ways to recover from those. And there's water storage, there are different fertilizers, there are things that you can do to help prevent that. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, I'm not saying that they didn't have any answers, but there were often problems that they didn't have a large enough solution for, and people went without food. They just could not eat. They had to either relocate or starve. 1845 through the mid-1850s is known in Europe as the Great Famine. And this affected a lot of Europe, but very specifically, it just wreaked havoc in Ireland. And it's estimated that around 2 million people had to leave the area to find a new home, and they had to choose between that and starving. So this famine was caused by crop failure, potatoes specifically, and the crop failure was caused by blight. Blight is a fungal or bacterial infestation in plants, and it just kills everything if it is able to. And this season was particularly wet and humid, which causes blight to just grow very quickly. Not only does it hurt the plant, but it gets into the root system and can even, from what I understand, get into the soil. Now, I've read conflicting evidence of whether or not it will stay in the soil or not, but most things that I read says that it will. I did not grow up in a farmer's family. This is a little bit out of my depth, but I did grow up around farmers. And for an individual family in Indiana, I know how much crop failure can affect them. But imagine an entire country, a whole landmass, an island that loses its cash crop. And not only its cash crop, but the crop that the entire civilization is used to eating. This is their diet. This is their food, and it is gone. It's estimated that 50% of Ireland relied on potato for a lot of their diet, but in Western Ireland, it's likely that most everybody relied on potatoes for their entire nutrition. That's all they ate. What we want to do today is take this ingredient that they so desired in this time period, but they could not get their hands on, and we want to say, okay, if they could have, if this family could have gotten their hands on just a few potatoes, what would have been a real treat for them? And so we don't want to make the lowest of low dishes, but we want to make a couple of potato dishes that are a little bit elevated. They're not the fanciest thing in the world, but man, are they good. And this would be a real feast to someone who was craving potatoes and could not get them. All three recipes that we're going to do today come out of the same book, even the same page, which I don't think has ever happened before. It's The Universal Cook by Francis Collingwood and John Woolhams, and it was written in 1792. The first one is to fry potatoes. To fry potatoes. Having cut your potatoes into thin slices as large as a crown piece, fry them brown, lay them in a plate or dish, and pour melted butter and sack and sugar over them. For this first recipe, we're just going to take our potatoes, we're going to cut them into thin slices. It says about the size of a crown piece. We're going to fry them until they're brown, take them out and put them in whatever we're going to serve them in, a bowl or a plate. Put some melted butter, some sack, which is a fortified white wine, and then put a little bit of sugar over top. When potatoes first came to Europe, people were a little nervous about them. They're a member of the nightshades family, and so they were primarily grown and botanical gardens. People thought that they were a beautiful plant. They liked to look at them. They wanted to study them, but they were not quick to eat them, even though they knew people in other parts of the world were eating them. The fruit of a potato plant is poisonous. People knew that. They were afraid of that. They weren't gonna say, well, I'm just gonna eat the root right away. They're gonna wait off a little bit. And so they fed them to livestock, and they eventually became poor people food. As poor people food, folks in Europe were really excited about this because it is a high yielding crop and it's fairly calorically dense. So they could feed a lot of people and they don't really have to worry about running out of potatoes, so they thought. It was replacing things like turnips. It was replacing other staple crops because they were able to feed a lot of people, and you can do a lot with potatoes. I mean, a lot of circumstances, you could just boil them and there's food. So they were using this as poor people food, they were using this as livestock food, and eventually folks warm up to potatoes and it starts even making its way to the highest tables. The second recipe for today is something that we're all familiar with if you've ever had a Thanksgiving dinner, and it is called to mash potatoes. To mash potatoes, boil and peel them and put them into a saucepan. Mash them well and put a pint of milk to 2 pounds of potatoes. Add a little salt, stir them well together, and take care that they do not stick to the bottom. Then take 1/4 pound of butter, stir it in, and send them up to the table. For this second recipe, we're just gonna make some mashed potatoes. So you're going to either peel first or second, but you need to boil your potatoes, and you're gonna put them into a saucepan and mash them up with milk and salt. And then after they're mashed, you're gonna make sure that they don't stick to the bottom of your saucepan, and you're gonna add the butter, stir it all up, get it nice and incorporated, and then they go up to the table. Now, during this big exodus from Ireland, a lot of people were coming over to the New World. I've read a few different numbers. It seems like right about 500,000 are documented, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000. But they also estimate that a ton of people came over that were not documented, and it's likely that somewhere even maybe around 1.5 million came to America during this major movement from Ireland. And that is a lot of new people, all from the same culture, that are coming here and they're changing food in America. Primitive Cookery is a book that we lean on a lot because it's specifically made for folks to be able to have more affordable food. They really kind of go into explaining why the ingredients are good for poor folks. In this particular example with potatoes, they're talking about all the different ways that you can eat them. You can boil them, you can slice them and fry them, you can use them with a gravy or with a ketchup. You can put milk and sugar on them and make them kind of a sweet thing. And he's basically saying the poorest of the poor, they're gonna boil it and just put some salt on it. And as you kind of increase in income, then you start bringing in butter, you start bringing in sugar, milk, cream. So this is an ingredient that can grow with your income because of what you're adding to it, but it is good for all classes. The poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich are enjoying potatoes. This last recipe is kind of building off of ideas from the second recipe, and it's called to scallop potatoes. We're going to make a potato mash, but we're gonna do something extra special with it. To scallop potatoes, first boil your potatoes and then beat them in a bowl with some good cream and a lump of butter and salt. Put them into scallop shells. Make them smooth on top, score them with a knife, lay thin slices of butter upon the top of them, and put them in a Dutch oven to brown. For our scallop potatoes, we're going to make a mash again, but it's gonna be a little bit different. We're gonna put them into a bowl this time, not a saucepan, and we're gonna put to them some good cream like it says, some butter and some salt. We're gonna mash them all up, and then once that's done, we're gonna put them into these shells, and we're gonna put them in the shells and make them look smooth on top. And then we're gonna take our knife and we're gonna score them so that they look like a shell as well. And when that happens, we're gonna slice some butter, we're gonna put that on top and get them into a Dutch oven so that the top of the potatoes browns. And it's gonna be a real nice treat when these come to the table. They're gonna look really great. It's easy today to look at a potato and kind of write it off. It's easy to say, that's just filler food, or I'm tired of potatoes, especially if you've ever been in a situation where things were a little tight and you ate a lot of potatoes. You can be one of those foods that you're sick of. But what we want to do today is just celebrate this ingredient. These people in this time moved their entire life because potatoes would not grow, and that's what they needed. So we wanted to make some nicer dishes with them, and we're gonna give them a try right now. I'm not really sure what to expect out of this fried potato because I have never had fried potatoes with sack and sugar before. Let's get one. That's really, really interesting, and it's really good because you've got this kind of just a little bit of sweetness to go with the normal buttery potato, but the frying makes it really crunchy, and that's really nice. It's kind of like a potato chip with just a little bit of sweetness. Now, mashed potatoes. I'm a Midwest boy. I've had my fair share of mashed potatoes. So I don't think there's gonna be any surprise here. Nope. Fantastic. Milk, butter, salt. That's all you need. This one I'm not so sure about. I don't think I've ever made mashed potatoes with heavy cream. And this is like a twice baked potato, so kind of cool. Let's see what's going on here. I got some crusty. Much more rich than just the mashed potato. And I like that crust and that like kind of brown cooked area on the top. This is delicious. Any one of these you can try at home. They're fantastic. I think that you will really like them, especially try this fried potato with sugar.
This is an investigation, and we are the detectives. I have with me Michael Dragoo, and we are going to try to figure out what is the real hash. Understanding historical recipes is very complex, and Michael and I have been looking at historical recipes for decades. Now, they are complex in that we don't always understand the words they're using, they don't use amounts, we don't even understand their instructions at times. So each time you dig into a historical recipe, it's like an archaeological expedition.
One of the issues we have when we're researching recipes is removing ourselves from the equation. We're the ones interpreting, but we have to interpret. We have to let the facts of what the writer of the recipe is saying and not just assume something. And hash, the things that we're going to do today, are a good example. Hash to me is a can that I open. It's got potatoes and beef in it. I dump it in a pan, I warm it up, I eat it with fried eggs. Well, if I enter into trying to understand this recipe with that preconceived notion, I might be way off base. It reminds me that you just have to let the facts guide you and not let what you think is right determine what's happening.
We'll be working on 2 recipes today, and it's a great example of understanding one recipe by the other recipe. So we can think about hash today, but I'm going to be looking at a hash that's from, say, 1791 to about 1825, and he'll be looking at a hash that's from 1650 or 1660. So understanding the 3 different hashes today, and the one from the early 19th century and the one from the 17th century helps us understand an evolution here, and we can kind of backwards interpret the one that I'll be doing to the one that Michael's doing.
Alrighty, well, for those who don't know me, my name is Michael Dragoo. I'm an historical foodways demonstrator, and my time period is from the French and Indian War up to the Rev War, 1750s to 1780s. I've worked with Townsends now for about 11 years. I can be found on Instagram at just Michael Dragoo. So my recipe is from Robert May, 1665, and it's called To Make a Hash of Raw Beef. And I'm just going to read the recipe. It's rather simple until you start to try to figure out what they mean. Mince it very small with some beef suet or lard and some sweet herbs, some beaten cloves and mace, pepper, nutmeg, and a whole onion or 2. Stew it all together in a pipkin with some blanched chestnuts, strong broth, and some claret. Let it stew slowly in the space of 3 hours, that it may be very tender, then blow off the fat, dish it, and serve it on sippets. Garnish it with barberries, grapes, or gooseberries. So first off, I have to remove myself from the situation because otherwise I'm going to enter into this thinking that it's a thing that I'm going to eat with a fork next to a fried egg. Also, what strikes me is it starts out being a savory dish, but halfway through we start making it sweet. So I'm interested to see how this turns out taste-wise. In this time period, we're seeing the word hash not just be a verb, but be a noun. Hash means to just mince up something finely, but it also is a thing by this time. Stew in this time period is still a verb. It's not a noun yet. My first step is to take this beef and to get it as finely chopped as I can with my knife, and then I'm gonna mince it with a chopper in a bowl. As I'm doing that, I'm gonna add some lard and then my spices, my cloves, mace, pepper, and nutmeg, and an onion, and then I'm just gonna stew that all together for a couple of hours. And once we get everything stewing together, we're gonna add some blanched chestnuts, a strong broth, and some claret, which is almost sweet wine from the time period, and we're gonna let it stew slowly for about 3 hours. And once that's completed, then I'm gonna just make a couple of sippets, which is nothing more than dried bread, buttered on both sides and fried. And then we're gonna garnish it, and then we're gonna taste it and see how it goes. One of the mysteries of this recipe are chestnuts. You know, some people might think of them as savory. I think John and I both agree it's more of a sweet addition. They call for blanched chestnuts, and you're taking a chestnut, you're scoring the flat side of the chestnut, you're boiling it, and then you're peeling it, and that's what we've done here. We've peeled it, but it doesn't say what to do to it. It just says with some blanched chestnuts, and then it lists some other ingredients. So what I think I'm going to do is mince it up and reduce it a little further, and it'll probably dissolve. And it'll be no different than flour, perhaps. You can use different nuts to thicken things. That may be what they're thinking of here. I don't know, but we're about to find out.
Michael's recipe was from the 17th century, so 1650, 1660. But if we push forward into the 18th century, we can find hash recipes. Now, it's interesting that early recipe that Michael did, it was hashing raw beef. But many of the recipes I've seen for hash seem to be something you do with leftovers. Let's make a hash of this. We've got some meat left over, and that's what our recipe looks like. It either says make a hash with cold mutton or cold beef. And this recipe we find very late and very common, as late as 1848. If we trace this recipe back, the earliest one I find that gets really close is Mrs. Fraser's Book of Cookery here, which is from 1791. And her recipe is you take some cold meat and we basically make this huge fancy gravy. At the end of that, we put the already cold meat in it, just warm it up and serve it. It's ready to go on little sippets. So let me read to you the recipe from, let's say, 1804, which is the best kind of balanced recipe for this cold beef hash. To hash cold beef or mutton, cut it down in thin slices and break the bones. Take such parts of the meat as is not fit for the hash and boil it with the bones and the onion or two for stock. When the stock is ready, strain, thicken it with browned butter and flour, add a little ketchup, salt, spices. When it comes to a boil, scum it, and then throw in the hash. So throw in the meat and let it get 2 or 3 quick boils. If there was any of the gravy of the cold meat left, put it in, keeping out the fat. This hash is much better with cut pickles. Dish it on sippets or toasted bread. This same recipe keeps moving on through the 19th century, and it gets a little fancier. So in 1824, we have almost exactly the same recipe, except they start adding spices like allspice, and they also put parsley in here. It also has mushroom ketchup, or possibly even the liquid from pickled onions. It also has mustard, capers, nasturtiums, and garlic. So we can see what's happening here. The spices and some of the flavors change as we move into that 19th century, and they start to try to make it an expensive dish. This recipe is all about the sauce or the gravy that we're going to be making. That's where all the time is spent. The meat is already basically cooked. In fact, we just cut it up into little slices, and at the very end, we toss it in and just warm it up, and then it's ready to serve. So where is this sauce really made out of? And it's made out of a bone broth and gravy, and then it has a roux to thicken it, along with whatever we use as the super flavoring. And if we look at that one recipe, that later recipe, they basically say, flavor it any way you want. But in essence, make it strong. It's something that's got a lot of flavor to it, regardless of what we use. So we're going to be using something like mushroom ketchup. The closest thing you're probably familiar with is like Worcestershire sauce. It's going to be a very strong flavored kind of sauce that goes onto these sippets. In this recipe, our meat is already cooked. She starts to tell us how to make bone broth. We already have our broth prepared, so we are going to start off with creating a simple roux with some flour and some butter. We'll add our broth to that, and that will be our base mixture. Then we're going to start to add our spices and flavorings, and we'll taste this and see how it comes together. We'll add a little bit of something like mushroom ketchup and then some of these other things to give us that strong savory flavor, which is a complete contrast to the sweeter flavors that should be in that early recipe. Once our sauce is properly flavored and heated up, we can add in our cold meat, cut into very fine slices, hashed up as it were. Then all that has to do is get just warmed enough, and then we will serve it on the sippets. So here we have two very different interpretations. As we go into it as an investigation and as detectives, we can see how very different the concepts can be when you come out of a recipe. So we're gonna have some fun with tasting these out.
Call it what you will.
If you were going to do yours differently, how would you do it?
If I weren't trying to be authentic to the recipe, I would have had it more sloppy like this one.
Why do you think that recipe wasn't sloppy?
Well, we were talking between edits, and we think that perhaps the chestnuts would have been the thickening agent. I put enough in for taste. Were I to have reduced them further, and I also didn't simmer it for 3 hours, they were calling for much more of everything, and I reduced it all. Were that to have simmered for 3 hours, I might have had something more thick, but they generally are asking for a ball of butter, and you're pushing as much flour into it, and they'll tell you what size, a walnut or whatever. They didn't do any of that this time, and so I assumed, based on what I read, that this was not going to be a sloppy thing. Now that you've completed yours, is there anything you would have done differently, or you think you interpreted everything correctly? Or?
It's hard to say. I mean, the consistency looks like I expected it to look, and I threw the kitchen sink at this guy on flavors, and I usually don't like that many different things competing. So
He had
I
like
think
90
I would have
things.
right. I think I would have just basically stuck with the broth, the mushroom ketchup, and maybe a couple of the spices, and pulled back on some of the other ones. Right. But hey, maybe it's really good. We're gonna start off with Michael's. This is the earlier recipe, and it's the one that should have some sweetness to it. It even has that garnish. We've got a couple grapes here if we wanna kind of have those with the dish, so we can kind of figure out whether the sweetness is gonna work for it or not. Yes, cheers.
Cheers, maybe. I have 4 spices and 2 herbs. And a good gravy, which is where my salt is coming from. It doesn't ask for salt. It's got some pepper, that's one of the spices. Closing my eyes and eating it, I like the taste very much. I prefer that, I think, I haven't tasted it, but I prefer that consistency, I think, to this crumbly thing. But once again, this is more reminding me of corned beef hash. That's what we're intending. This is a 300 and whatever, almost 300-year-old recipe. So I'm not positive where they were going. I don't know.
It's got some good flavors. I do think the consistency is an issue, that if we could get a thick sauce with it, it would definitely work better with the sippets.
Well, do you think that the chestnuts would have provided that thickening agent?
Only one way to find out.
We're doing this again. I'd rather just eat the grapes, I think.
No, it's got a good balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see how, you could even maybe have them sliced up and on those sippets if you wanted to, and it's not a combination that I would have ever thought of. Okay, let's dive into the later version here.
I'm interested.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of ingredients.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot going on, but I like the tanginess of its acids, several acids. You got mustard.
Yep.
Didn't you have dill?
Yes.
Or
There's
something
pickles
pickled?
in there. There's, it's everything. It's just throw it all at it. And it's like, empty the refrigerator into this thing, It's like whatever you've got, just toss it in there. And the flavor is just excellent. It's really good. Thank you, Michael, for coming along on this investigation of what a hash really is.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And I hope you have a chance to try each one of these because they're both great.